On a frigid December night in 1831, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a man named Charlie Silver vanished from his one-room cabin. When the search party arrived, they found his body dismembered, burned in the hearth, and buried beneath the floorboards. His killer was his 18-year-old wife, Frankie. The newspapers screamed of a jealous monster who butchered her husband with an axe. But under the laws of that time, Frankie Silver was forbidden from speaking a single word in her own defense at trial. So what really happened in that isolated cabin? Was this the cold-blooded act of a she-devil, or was it the desperate last stand of a terrified girl with no other way out? To understand what happened, you have to understand the world they lived in. This wasn't a town. It wasn't even a settlement. This was the raw, untamed heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the early 1830s, a place carved from rock and hardship. Their home was a single-room log cabin perched in a lonely hollow near the rushing waters of the Tow River. The wind didn't just whistle through the gaps in the logs, it moaned. The mountains weren't just a backdrop, they were a green cage, beautiful and deadly, that cut you off from the rest of the world. Life in that cabin was a relentless battle for survival. Their entire universe was contained within those 4 log walls, with a dirt floor under their feet and a stone hearth that was the center of their existence. It was where they cooked, where they slept, and where they found their only defense against the bone-deep cold of a mountain winter. It was a place of immense intimacy, but also a place with nowhere to hide, where every frustration and every dark thought had no room to escape. Charlie Silver was just 19, but he was a man of the woods. He lived by his rifle and his traps, often disappearing for days at a time into the deep forest, chasing deer or checking his lines for beaver and fox. He was young, strong, and restless, a man who understood the language of the wilderness far better than the quiet, contained life of a husband and father. He was the one who brought the outside world and the meat for their table back to that isolated cabin. And in that cabin was Frankie. At 18, she was already a wife and a mother to their 1-year-old daughter, Nancy. While Charlie roamed the mountains, her world shrank to the size of that single room. Her days were measured by the cry of her baby, the crackle of the fire, and the deafening silence of the hollows. That kind of isolation can do strange things to a person. It can sharpen your fears until they have a razor's edge, and it can make the 4 walls of your home feel like a tomb. You can imagine their life was a cycle of hard work, long waits, and the brief, simple relief of reunion. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of an axe splitting firewood, the sight of Charlie returning through the trees with game slung over his shoulder. This was their ordinary life. This was the world they had built, fragile as it was. But the winter of 1831 was coming, and it carried a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The conflict that ended Charlie Silver's life didn't begin that December night. Its seeds were planted generations before in the very soil of those mountains. You have to remember who these people were. They were the descendants of Scots-Irish pioneers, a people known for their fierce independence and their stubborn refusal to bow to anyone. They hadn't been given this land, they had tamed it. They had wrestled a living from the rocky hillsides, fighting the woods, the winters, and sometimes each other for every acre. This land held memories of blood. It was not a peaceful place. Many of their grandfathers had been over-mountain men, the frontier riflemen who fought with brutal efficiency in the Revolutionary War. They learned a hard lesson in those days, that the only law you can truly count on is the one you enforce yourself. That belief seeped into the ground and rose up like a mountain mist. They distrusted authority from distant towns like Morganton. They settled their own disputes, often with a fist or a rifle, and they kept their secrets locked tight within the family. To be a Silver in that part of the country meant something. They were known as a hardy clan of hunters and trappers, men who knew the mountains like the back of their own calloused hands. They were proud, quick-tempered, and not to be crossed. A Silver man was expected to be the master of his domain, whether that was 100 acres of woodland or the four walls of a one-room cabin. It was a heavy legacy for a young man like Charlie to carry, a pressure to be tough, to be in control, to never show weakness. Frankie came from the Stewart clan, people just as tough and rooted in the mountains as the Silvers. But when she married Charlie, she crossed a line. She became a Silver. In that world, a woman's identity was tied completely to her husband. Her reputation was his reputation. Her duty was to him. This wasn't a partnership of equals. It was a hierarchy as old and as unyielding as the mountains themselves. Frankie wasn't just an isolated wife. She was an outsider who now lived under the formidable shadow of the Silver name. In a place this isolated, the only thing that traveled faster than a winter storm was a rumor. And the air around the Silver cabin had grown thick with them. The community wasn't just a collection of distant neighbors, it was a web of eyes and ears. Every family was connected by blood, marriage, or shared hardship, and they all kept a close watch on one another. The two most watchful sets of eyes belonged to Charlie's father, Jacob, and his brother, John. The Silvers looked after their own, and from the start, they viewed Frankie, the Stewart girl, with a certain suspicion. They saw her as the outsider who had taken one of their boys. Whispers followed Charlie Silver when he came down from the mountains. Some said he had a temper that could flare up like a flash flood, especially when he'd been drinking. Stories of arguments that echoed through the hollow, of a young man growing restless and bitter with the heavy burdens of a wife and child were passed from cabin to cabin. These weren't necessarily malicious tales. They were just observations, the way mountain people took the measure of a man. But each story added another thread to a net that was slowly tightening around that little cabin. The most poisonous rumor of all was that Charlie was planning to leave, not just for a long hunt, but for good. The story went that he'd been saving money and that he planned to take their daughter, Nancy, and head west, where a man could start over. Some versions of the rumor even gave his plan a name, another woman waiting for him somewhere down the trail. For a young wife like Frankie, alone and entirely dependent on her husband, this wasn't just gossip, it was a death sentence. You have to understand, these whispers weren't just idle talk. In a world built on honor and reputation, they were stones being thrown. Frankie would have felt their impact every day. A neighbor who wouldn't quite meet her eye. A sudden silence when she approached a group of women at the creek. The air in that community was charged with unspoken judgments and hidden tensions long before Charlie disappeared. The isolation of her cabin became a social quarantine, leaving her trapped with her fears and a husband who, the whispers said, was ready to abandon her. So when that fateful December arrived, the stage was already set. This wasn't a sudden storm breaking over a clear sky. This was the culmination of months of pressure building up behind a cracking dam. The Silver clan was watching, the neighbors were whispering, and inside that one-room cabin, a silent, bitter war was being waged. The mountains have a way of talking to those who know how to listen, and in the weeks leading up to that Christmas, they were screaming. The old folks would later say the winter of 1831 came on with an unnatural bitterness, a cold that felt personal, like a premonition. They said the screech owls cried from the ridges with a sound that wasn't just a call, but a shiver looking for a spine to run down. In the folklore of those hills, a screech owl calling near a home was a death warning, a sign that a soul was about to be claimed. And the owls, they say, were crying nightly over the Silver cabin. But the most dangerous omen wasn't in the sky. It was sitting across the hearth. Charlie Silver had become a stranger in his own home. The restlessness that had always been part of him had curdled into something darker. He was a caged animal, pacing the confines of his small life, and his eyes were fixed on the distant promise of the West. Every mention of leaving, every coin he saved and hid away, wasn't just a plan, it was a threat. His presence in the cabin was no longer a comfort for Frankie, but a constant, grinding source of tension. He was the human catalyst, the walking, breathing prophecy of the disaster to come. And Frankie felt it. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, a cold knot that had nothing to do with the winter chill. She would stand in the doorway of the cabin with baby Nancy on her hip and look out at the woods. The familiar trees now seemed to cast long, grasping fingers of shadow. The wind whistling through the hollow sounded like it was whispering a warning she couldn't quite understand. It was a suffocating sense of dread, the feeling you get when you're standing on a precipice in the dark. She couldn't have known what was about to happen, but she knew with every fiber of her being that her world was about to be torn apart. The night of December 22nd, 1831, arrived cold and clear. Inside the silver cabin, the fire in the hearth would have been battling the bitter chill, casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn log walls. The baby, Nancy, was asleep, and in that suffocating little room, the final act began. We will never know the exact words that were spoken between Frankie and Charlie. The fire was the only witness, and it keeps its secrets. But we know that a line was crossed, a point from which there could be no retreat. Perhaps it happened just as the prosecution later claimed. Charlie, his mind set on a new life in the West, finally told her. Maybe he said it calmly, maybe he said it cruelly. He was leaving. He was taking the money they had scraped together. And most devastating of all, he was taking their daughter. For Frankie, this would have been a declaration of war, a sentence of slow starvation and disgrace in the wilderness. In that moment, he ceased to be her husband and became the man who was going to steal her child and destroy her world. Or maybe the mountain legend is true. Maybe Charlie came home that night not with a plan, but with a bottle's worth of rage inside him. Maybe an argument over nothing exploded into violence. The legend whispers that he threatened Frankie, that he even threatened to harm the baby. In this version, Frankie wasn't a woman scorned, she was a mother protecting her young. He wasn't a man with a dream of the West. He was a drunken monster who had brought the terror of the outside world into the one place she was supposed to be safe. Whichever story is true, the result was the same. A final, unbearable choice was forced upon Frankie Silver. And in that cabin, there was a tool. It was an axe. It was not a weapon of murder. It was an instrument of survival used every single day to split the firewood that kept them from freezing to death. It was a familiar weight in a woman's hands. As Charlie turned his back, or as he fell into a drunken, snoring sleep by the fire, Frankie's hand closed around that smooth, worn handle. The decision was made. The argument was over. The whispers and the fears of the past months all converged into one single, terrible point of focus. The firelight glinted on the polished steel of the axe head. The sound of her own heart was likely a deafening drum in her ears. In the silence that followed the last angry word, she lifted the tool that had kept her family alive, and in the next moment, she would use it to end her husband's life. The first drops of blood were about to fall. We must now step into that cabin, into the moment after the axe has fallen. There was no scream. There was only a dull, wet thud that was nothing like the sound of splitting firewood. It was a soft, final sound. And then, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the crackle of the fire itself. In that instant, the world stopped. Charlie Silver lay still on the floor, a dark stain spreading slowly from his head into the packed earth. The argument was over. The threats were silenced. And a new, more terrible reality had begun. Imagine the scene. The firelight flickers, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. The baby, Nancy, stirs in her sleep, but does not wake. For Frankie, this must have been a moment of pure, frozen terror. The man who had been her husband, the father of her child, was now just a body. An impossible problem. He was too heavy to move, too large to bury in the frozen winter ground. To leave him was to be discovered instantly. And in that small, isolated space, a desperate, gruesome plan began to form in the mind of a terrified 18-year-old girl. What followed was not an act of rage, but a feat of horrific, back-breaking labor. In the long, cold hours of that December night, Frankie Silver, a small woman by all accounts, began the task of dismantling her husband's body. She used the same tools they used for survival, the axe that had killed him, the knives they used for skinning deer. This was not the work of a monster reveling in gore. It was the frantic mechanical work of someone trying to erase a terrible truth, to make a man disappear. The only witness was the fire in the hearth. That fire, which had been the heart of their home, the source of warmth and life, now became a hungry mouth. Piece by piece, she fed the flames. The smoke that curled up the chimney and out into the cold mountain air would have changed, growing heavy and greasy, carrying a secret that would stain the very stones of the fireplace. The smell in that cabin must have been unimaginable, the air thick with the evidence of her work. Some parts would not burn. For these, she pried up the heavy puncheon floorboards of her own home. She dug into the cold, damp earth beneath the cabin and buried what the fire could not consume. With every handful of dirt she replaced, she was turning her home into a grave, a tomb sealed by her own hands. The pools of blood seeped down between the logs, a silent testament to the slaughter that had occurred just a few feet above. According to the stories, one piece was treated differently. The heart. It wasn't burned or buried with the rest. It was hidden away separately, found later in a hollowed-out stump near the cabin. Why? Was this a final symbolic act of hatred? Or was it something else, a moment of confusion in a mind pushed past the edge of sanity? We will never know. It remains one of the most chilling and inexplicable details of the entire affair. As the first grey light of dawn crept over the mountain ridges, the work was finally done. The fire smoldered with a strange, unnatural heat. The floorboards were back in place. From the outside, the cabin looked just as it always had, a lonely puff of smoke rising into the winter sky. But inside, everything had changed. Frankie Silver was alone with her child, and a secret that was buried in the ashes and under the floor, a secret that could never be contained. Let us, for a moment, try to do what the court never could. Let's try to step inside the mind of Frankie Silver in those terrifying hours. This is not to excuse what she did, but to understand the mechanics of how a human being can arrive at such a brutal act. What switch flips in a person's mind to turn a wife and mother into a killer who could dismember her husband by the light of their own hearth fire? Let's first walk the path the prosecution laid out, the path of the jealous monster. In this version, her mind was a pressure cooker of resentment and fear. The core of her logic was twisted but simple. He is going to destroy me. In her world, a woman abandoned by her husband, her child stolen away, was a non-person. She would be an object of pity and scorn, left to starve or depend on the charity of relatives who already saw her as an outsider. Charlie's plan to go west wasn't just a betrayal, it was an act of annihilation. The switch flipped the moment his threat became real. The instant he said the words, he ceased to be her husband and became a mortal enemy who had to be stopped. What followed was not a crime of passion, but an act of ice-cold logic. The dismemberment, then, was not a frenzy. It was a problem to be solved. A grim, terrible task performed with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to survive in the wilderness. But there is another path, the one whispered in the mountains. The path of the terrified victim. Here, the logic is not twisted. It is primal. He is going to kill my child. In this scenario, Charlie is not a man with a plan, but a drunken, violent force of nature. The switch flips the instant his rage turns towards the baby's crib. In that second, all thought of wife, husband, law, and future vanishes. There is only the mother animal, cornered in her den, protecting her young from a predator. The axe is not a tool of murder. It is a fang, a claw, a desperate act of defense. What happens next is not cold calculation, but pure, shrieking panic. The dismemberment is a frantic, horrifying attempt to hide what she has done, driven by the certain knowledge that no one will ever believe her. She isn't trying to erase a man, she's trying to erase a moment of justifiable terror that she knows will be her death sentence. After the deed was done, did she feel triumph, relief, or a chilling, bottomless emptiness? If she was the jealous killer, she might have felt a grim sense of victory, the quiet of a problem solved, quickly replaced by the cold fear of discovery. If she was the abused wife, she would have felt nothing but a hollow, ringing terror, a mind shattered by what she'd been forced to do. Only Frankie knew which path she walked in her own mind. And that is the most terrifying part of all. In the days that followed, an unnatural quiet settled over the silver cabin. It was the silence of a secret. Frankie moved like a ghost through the small room, tending to the baby, stoking the fire, sweeping the dirt floor with a frantic energy. To any neighbor who might pass, she would have looked like a woman waiting for her husband to return from a long hunt. But inside, the air was thick with what was missing. Every creak of the logs, every cry from the baby, must have sounded like an accusation. The outside world soon came knocking. First came the questions, casual at first. Seen Charlie? Frankie had her stories ready, but they shifted like smoke. To one person, she'd say he'd gone off on a long hunting trip and was overdue. To another, she'd let slip a more bitter tale, that he'd taken the money they had saved, abandoned her and the child, and run off to the west. The stories didn't match, and in a community where every detail was noted and remembered, these contradictions were like cracks appearing in a frozen river. Her fight for survival had become a performance. She had to play the part of the wronged wife, worried but also resentful. She had to manage her grief, her fear, and her lie all at once, under the constant, watchful gaze of the community. Little Nancy was her anchor, the living reason for what she had done. But the child was also a constant reminder of the man who was gone, making the charade that much harder to maintain. But Charlie's family, especially his father Jacob and his brother John, they weren't buying it. They knew Charlie. He was a skilled woodsman, yes, but he was also a silver. He wouldn't just vanish without a word, leaving his rifle and his dogs behind. Abandoning his family was one thing, but leaving his hunting tools was something else entirely. It was a detail that was fundamentally wrong, a note so out of tune it made their teeth ache. Their suspicion grew from a quiet unease into a certainty. Something terrible had happened to their boy. So they started the hunt. It wasn't a formal posse of lawmen, not at first. It was the clan, the family, taking matters into their own hands. They gathered their neighbors and began to search the woods, the creeks, the ravines around the cabin. Days turned into a week. They found no tracks, no sign of a hunting camp, no trace of a man lost in the wilderness. And with every failed search, all eyes turned back to the one place every trail led, the little log cabin where Frankie Silver waited with her shifting stories and a fire that never seemed to go out. The hunt for a missing man was about to become a search for a body. The moment the first piece of Charlie Silver's body was pulled from beneath the cabin floor, the whispers in the community turned into a roar. A line was drawn in the dirt, as clear and deep as the Tow River itself. You were either for the Silvers or you were for the Stewarts. There was no middle ground, no place for neutrality. The murder of one man had become a war between two clans, and every single person in that part of the mountains was forced to choose a side. The general store, the churchyard, the grist mill, these places became the tense gathering points for the factions. The Silver camp was loud, fueled by righteous fury and raw grief. Charlie was their son, their brother, their friend. They told the story of a cold-blooded she-devil who had lured their boy to his doom. Neighbors who had hunted with Charlie, men who owed Jacob Silver a favor, and those who simply believed in the old law of an eye for an eye, they all stood with the Silvers, their voices demanding justice, which to them meant a rope. On the other side, the Stewart clan circled the wagons. Frankie was their daughter, their blood. They may have been horrified, they may have been confused, but they would not abandon one of their own to the mercy of the Silvers. Their camp was quieter, more watchful. Their loyalty gave rise to a powerful conspiracy of silence. Many people knew Charlie had a temper. Many had heard the rumors of his planned abandonment, but who would dare speak of it now? To defend Frankie, even to suggest there might be another side to the story, was to paint a target on your own back. The Silvers were a powerful family, and their anger was a dangerous fire. Fear became a currency, and silence was the only way to stay safe. This division wasn't just abstract, it played out in small, defining actions. Frankie's own mother and brother were immediately suspected of helping her, of choosing the loyalty of blood over the law of men. A neighbor who might have seen them near the cabin that night would have looked the other way, his silence a shield for himself and an alibi for them. In contrast, another neighbor, seeing the greasy smoke pouring from the chimney for days, finally worked up the courage to tell Jacob Silver his suspicions. That act wasn't just sharing information, it was a public declaration of allegiance, a brave or foolish step, depending on who you asked. The community had fractured, turning lifelong friends into wary strangers and neighbors into potential enemies. After the verdict, Frankie Silver was a dead woman walking. But her family, the Stewart clan, refused to accept it. To them, the trial in Morganton had been a farce, a piece of legal theater orchestrated by the Silvers. Justice wasn't a blindfolded woman with a scale, it was a rope with a noose, and it was meant for their daughter. So her father, Isaiah, and her uncle concocted a desperate plan born from love and defiance. One night, a set of boys' clothes was smuggled into Frankie's cell. She was a small woman, and with her hair cut short, she could pass. They broke her out of the Morganton jail, and she vanished into the night. The Blue Ridge Mountains that had cradled her in her youth now became her last, best hiding place. With her father as her guide, Frankie fled back into the familiar labyrinth of ridges and hollows. They moved like ghosts, following game trails and creek beds, sleeping in caves and thickets. For a short, breathless time, she was free. She was no longer Frankie Silver, the convicted killer. She was just a boy, lost in the woods, a shadow among shadows. The mountains, which had been her cage, were now her sanctuary, their ancient silence her only shield. But back in the flatlands, a firestorm of rage had erupted. A posse was formed, led by the sheriff, but fueled by the cold fury of the Silver clan. They would not be cheated of their justice. A reward was posted, a substantial sum of money that echoed through the hills and hollows. It was a poison seed planted in the heart of the community. Suddenly, every neighbor, every old family friend had a price tag on their loyalty. The hunt for Frankie Silver became a hunt for gold. The chase was a desperate game of cat and mouse played out across miles of unforgiving terrain. The posse had numbers and dogs, but Frankie and her father had knowledge. They knew the secret paths, the places a stranger would never find. For days, they eluded capture, living off the land, always moving. You can just imagine the terror of it, the constant listening for the baying of hounds on the wind, the fear of a snapped twig giving away their position, the exhaustion that ground them down day by day. Finally, starving and exhausted, they were forced to seek help. They made their way across the county line into Rutherford, to the home of a family they thought they could trust. They took in the weary old man and the quiet, haunted-looking boy with him. For a moment, there was warmth, a hot meal, a chance to rest. But Frankie could not disguise her eyes. They were the one part of her that told her true story. The family recognized her, and the lure of the reward money was too strong. A quiet message was sent. The moment of capture wasn't a fierce firefight in the woods. It was a quiet, sickening betrayal. The sheriff and his men simply walked into the cabin. There was no struggle. Frankie, exhausted and cornered, knew the game was over. She had been run to ground not by the lawman's skill, but by a neighbor's greed. The mountains had given her a brief, wild freedom, but in the end, it was the people who lived among them who sealed her fate. The trial of Frankie Silver in March of 1832 was not a search for truth. It was a public spectacle. You have to picture the Morganton courthouse. It wasn't a sterile, quiet chamber of law. It was a tinderbox packed with bodies, smelling of wet wool and simmering hatred. Armed guards stood at the doors, not just to keep the prisoner in, but to keep the community from tearing itself apart. On one side of the room sat the Silver clan, their faces carved from stone, their eyes burning with a demand for vengeance. On the other side, huddled together, were the Stuarts, silent and grim, watching their world crumble. And in the middle of it all sat Frankie Silver. She was a small, silent figure, almost a child, swallowed up by the heavy machinery of the law. The most brutal fact of her trial was not the evidence against her, but the gag that the law itself had placed over her mouth. Under the legal customs of that time, an accused person could not testify in their own defense. She was a ghost at her own trial, forced to listen as lawyers and witnesses constructed the story of her life and her crime, while she was forbidden to speak a single word. She could not confirm, she could not deny, she could not explain. The prosecution had an easy task. The lawyer laid out the evidence piece by horrifying piece. He presented the bone fragments from the hearth, the blood-soaked earth from beneath the floorboards, the testimony of the searchers. He painted a simple, damning picture of a jealous, monstrous woman who had butchered her husband in a fit of rage because he planned to leave her. It was a story that was clean, brutal, and easy for a jury to understand. What could her lawyers do? They were hamstrung, fighting a ghost story with a mountain of physical evidence. They could argue points of law, they could question the witnesses, but they could not put their client on the stand to tell her side of the story. They couldn't tell the jury about Charlie's temper or about a potential threat to the baby, because the only person who could testify to that was legally silenced. They were fighting a fire with their bare hands. The verdict, when it came, was no surprise. The jury barely had to deliberate. The word guilty echoed in the tense courtroom. A wave of grim satisfaction rolled through the Silver side of the room. On the Stuart side, there was only the quiet devastation of the inevitable. The judge, his duty clear, sentenced Frances Silver to be hanged by the neck until she was dead. The law of men had spoken. The formal process of justice, as understood by the courts in Morganton, was complete. But looking at that small, muzzled woman being led away in chains, one has to ask the question that has haunted these mountains ever since. Was justice actually served? Or was it simply the final formal act of a tragedy whose ending had already been written in blood and ashes? The day Frankie Silver was hanged, a heavy silence fell over Morganton. The spectacle was over. But for the families involved, the story was just entering its next long chapter. For the Silvers, the verdict was not a victory, and the execution was not a release. They had their justice, their eye for an eye, but it didn't bring Charlie back. The horror of his death became a dark stone in the foundation of their family, a cautionary tale whispered to future generations about the dangers of marrying an outsider. The name Frankie Silver became a curse in their homes, a synonym for the ultimate betrayal. The justice they had won felt as cold and empty as a winter grave. For Frankie's family, the Stuarts, the shame was a poison that seeped into the ground they walked on. They were now the kin of a convicted killer, the first woman ever hanged in North Carolina. They bore the weight of her crime in every sideways glance at the general store, in every conversation that stopped when they approached. Her father, Isaiah, who had risked everything to break her out of jail, was a broken man. He lived out his days under a cloud of grief and suspicion. The family that had been proud and independent was now marked, forced to live with the consequences of an act they did not commit, but could never escape. And what of the child at the heart of it all? Little Nancy Silver was now an orphan, Her legacy a horror story. Her mother had murdered her father. She was raised by relatives, growing up in the shadow of a tragedy she was too young to remember, but could never outrun. She was the living, breathing embodiment of that terrible night, a constant reminder of the blood that connected the two feuding families. Her life would be forever defined by the actions of her parents, a quiet testament to the innocent lives that are shattered in the wake of such violence. In the wider community, a collective amnesia began to set in. The story was too ugly, the divisions it created too deep. To heal, the community had to forget. People stopped talking about Frankie Silver. Her name was scrubbed from polite conversation. The brutal murder, the sensational trial, the dramatic escape, it was all pushed down, buried under the relentless demands of survival. The scar on the community was deep, and the only way to live with it was to pretend it wasn't there, to cover it with a thick blanket of silence. But in the mountains, stories don't die. They just go to sleep, waiting for the right voice to wake them up again. And what is left of this story today? If you go looking for the physical traces of Frankie Silver, you will find mostly ghosts. The one-room cabin is long gone, its logs rotted back into the earth, reclaimed by the deep woods of the Tow River Valley. The forest has swallowed it whole, erasing the scar from the land, but not from the memory. The exact spot where the gallows stood in Morganton is a matter of debate, likely a paved street corner or a parking lot now, a place people pass every day without knowing they are walking over ground that was once consecrated by a terrible and public death. You will not find a tombstone for Frankie Silver. After the hanging, her body was likely given to her father, who buried her in an unmarked grave, perhaps in the family plot, perhaps at a lonely crossroads, as was the custom for those who died in disgrace. The exact location is a secret that died with him. In a way, this lack of a final resting place is her most fitting memorial. It has allowed her to become more than a historical figure. She is a legend, a ghost without a home, a whisper that still haunts the hollows. But the most powerful echo isn't in a place, it's in the people. The Silvers and the Stewarts still live in those mountains. For over a century, the two families lived in a state of tense silence, the memory of the murder a deep, uncrossable chasm between them. But in recent decades, the descendants of both Frankie and Charlie, many of them descended directly from their orphaned daughter Nancy, have begun to come together. They hold joint reunions, not to forget the tragedy, but to finally acknowledge their shared, tangled, and bloody roots. They are living proof that the wounds of the past, even the deepest ones, can eventually begin to heal. And yet, the most enduring monument to this entire tragedy is not made of stone or of flesh and blood. It is made of words and a simple, haunting melody. The ballad of Frankie Silver, whether it was her confession or her father's creation, became her true headstone. It escaped the mountains and was carried across the country by folk singers and storytellers. The ballad is what kept her story alive, ensuring that even when the community tried to bury it in silence, her name would never truly be forgotten. The people tried to move on, the buildings fell, and the graves were lost, but the mountains remember. And in the quiet hollows, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that lonesome, tragic song. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning, standing in the cold ashes of that 1831 cabin. Was Frankie Silver a cold-blooded monster of jealousy? Or was she a terrified victim of abuse who made a desperate last stand? The honest answer is that we will never know. The law of her time did not care about her reasons, her fears, or her side of the story. It cared only about the horrifying evidence found under her floorboards. Because she was legally forbidden to speak, we are left forever with two competing ghosts, the ghost of a brutally murdered man and the ghost of his wife's untold truth. The official record calls her a killer. The mountain legend calls her a victim. The reality is buried with her in that unmarked grave, and it will remain there forever. This story, then, is more than just a grim tale of murder. It is a profound and chilling lesson about the power of a voice and the terrible consequences of silence. Frankie Silver was silenced by the law, but an entire community was silenced by fear and by a fierce clan loyalty that chose sides instead of seeking truth. Her story warns us what happens when justice becomes a synonym for vengeance, and when a person's humanity is stripped away until they are nothing more than the sum of their worst possible act. It is a story not just of cruelty, but of the immense weight of the past in these mountains, and how a single act of violence can send ripples of grief and division down through the generations. The court of men gave its verdict. The whispers of the mountains gave another. And now, you have heard the evidence, the rumors, and the legends that surround one of Appalachia's darkest and most enduring tragedies. The truth itself is lost to the wind that blows through the Tow River Valley. But the story, the warning, the mystery, the sorrow of it all, that story is now yours to keep. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. The rope creaked in the cold February dark, a sound swallowed by the Missouri woods. The body of Ben Bolin swung from the limb of a white oak, a grim pendulum marking the end of a bloody Ozark chapter. To the men who put him there, he was a monster, a tyrant who terrorized the hills under the guise of justice. But just a few years earlier, many of those same men, or their neighbors, would have called him a savior, a dark angel sent to deliver them from chaos. So which was he? A righteous crusader who lost his way? Or a brutal killer who simply found the right mask to wear? Today, we're not just telling the story of a vigilante's death. We're peeling back over 100 years of rumor and legend to find the man himself, to understand how the iron fist of the bald Knobbers became a ghost, forever riding the haunted backroads of the Ozarks. To understand the firestorm that was the bald Knobbers, you must first walk through the world they burned down. Imagine the Ozarks in the 1880s. This wasn't a land of gentle hills and quaint cabins. It was a fortress built by nature. Light struggled to pierce the dense canopy of oak and hickory, leaving the hollows in a state of perpetual twilight. Creeks cut through limestone like silver knives, their waters running cold and clear. A man could get lost a mile from his own home and never be found. The land was beautiful, but it was a hard, unforgiving beauty that demanded respect and bred a deep sense of isolation. The people were as rugged as the land they worked. They were farmers, loggers, and hunters, their hands calloused and their faces etched by sun and hardship. Their lives were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, plowing the rocky soil in the spring, enduring the suffocating humidity of summer, harvesting their meager crops in the fall, and hunkering down for the long, cold winter. Their world was small, often no larger than the valley where they were born. A trip to the county seat in Forsyth was a major event. The law, headquartered in some far-off city like Springfield, was less than a rumor. It was a ghost, a thing that had no power here. But beneath this quiet surface of toil and survival, the poison of the past was still at work. The Civil War had never truly ended in these hills. It had simply shattered into 1,000 personal feuds. Neighbor had fought neighbor as bushwhackers and jayhawkers, and the memories of burned-out farms and midnight raids were passed down from father to son like a cursed inheritance. Trust was a rare commodity, usually reserved for immediate kin. At night, heavy wooden bars were dropped across cabin doors, and the sound of an unfamiliar horse was enough to make a man reach for the rifle he kept over the mantel. This simmering fear created a vacuum, and into that vacuum crept a new kind of evil. Gangs of thieves and cutthroats, like the notorious Taylor brothers, roamed the countryside, preying on the very people the law was supposed to protect. They stole livestock, burned barns, and terrorized families, knowing there would be no consequences. Decent folk felt helpless, trapped between the ghosts of old hatreds and the very real threat of modern outlaws. They were good people pushed to the edge, praying for a savior. And in the smoky corners of general stores and under the shade of churchyard oaks, a dangerous idea began to take root. It was whispered at first, a desperate question passed between men who were tired of being afraid. If the law wouldn't protect them, who would? If justice was blind or simply too far away, then perhaps it was time for them to create their own. They didn't know it yet, but they were laying the foundation for a movement that would offer them salvation with one hand and deliver damnation with the other. The storm was gathering, and its name was justice. The Ozarks weren't settled, they were conquered. Not from some foreign power, but from the wilderness itself. The families that put down roots here in the generations before the war were mostly Scots-Irish, a people known for their fierce independence and a deep-seated suspicion of any authority they didn't create themselves. They weren't given land grants from a distant king. They earned their homesteads with an axe, a plow, and a rifle. Every field cleared of rocks, every cabin raised log by log, was a testament to their grit. This land wasn't just property to them. It was a part of their identity, paid for in sweat and blood. To threaten a man's land was to threaten his very soul. Then came the Civil War, and it fell on these hills not like a conventional war, but like a plague. Missouri was a border state, and that border ran straight through the heart of every family and every town. This wasn't a war of blue and gray armies marching in formation. It was the war of the torch and the rope. It was a war of neighbors. Confederate sympathizers formed guerrilla bands known as bushwhackers, while Union men became jayhawkers. They didn't fight over grand strategy. They fought over livestock, loyalties, and long-held grudges. A midnight raid could leave a family homeless, or worse. The violence was intimate, personal, and it left scars that wouldn't heal for a century. When the war officially ended in 1865, the fighting in the Ozarks didn't stop. It just lost its flag. The men who had spent 4 years living by the gun found they couldn't simply go back to the plow. Some of the most brutal bushwhackers and jayhawkers simply became outlaws, continuing their reign of terror without the thin veil of military cause. They knew the secret paths, the hidden hollows, and the fear in people's hearts. They were the war's bitter harvest, and they choked the life out of the fragile peace. This is where the weight of a name became a life or death matter. A family name in Taney County wasn't just a label, it was a history. It told people where your father stood in the war. It whispered of old debts and unsettled scores. To be a Taylor was to carry the reputation of Confederate defiance and post-war banditry. To be a Kinney suggested a history of staunch unionism. Long before the bald knobbers ever pulled on their masks, the battle lines were already drawn, etched into the landscape by the ghosts of the war. The conflict to come wasn't new. It was simply the old feud, waiting for a spark to set the hills ablaze once more. In the center of this simmering pot was Nat Kinney. He wasn't a vigilante by nature. He was a Union veteran, a respected farmer, and the Sunday school superintendent. People listened when he spoke. He saw the moral decay, the fear in his neighbors' eyes, and it offended his sense of order. On the other side were men like the Taylor brothers, who swaggered through the county as if they owned it. They and their associates were the festering wound, a constant source of trouble, known for their love of whiskey, brawling, and taking whatever they pleased. They were the embodiment of the lawlessness that Kinney and other decent folk were growing to despise. The conflict didn't start with a gunshot, but with 1,000 smaller cuts. An old farmer's fence would be cut in the night, his cattle scattered for miles. A man who spoke too loudly against the outlaws in the Kirbyville saloon would find his corn crib burned to the ground a week later. These weren't random acts, they were messages. One of the most galling incidents involved a public fistfight where one of the Taylors brutally beat a younger man over a perceived slight, all while the local constable conveniently looked the other way. The message was clear. There is no law here but us. Fear is a patient poison, and it spreads through whispers. In the general store, while weighing out flour and salt, men would speak in low tones. Heard the Taylors were seen near John Green's place, right before his best mule went missing. At church socials, women would exchange worried glances, sharing stories of strange riders seen on the road after dusk. Every unsolved theft, every act of vandalism was laid at the feet of the same handful of families. Rumor hardened into fact, and suspicion curdled into a collective certainty. This constant drip of intimidation and gossip created a siege mentality. The community wasn't just being attacked from the outside, it was rotting from within. The outlaws were emboldened by the lack of consequences, and the law-abiding majority felt increasingly isolated and powerless. The air in Taney County grew thick with a toxic mix of fear and resentment. It wasn't just about stolen property anymore. It was about honor, dignity, and the terrifying realization that if they didn't draw a line in the dirt themselves, the tide of violence and chaos would soon wash away their homes, their families, and their entire way of life. The winter of 1884 bled into the spring of 1885 with a strange and heavy feeling in the air. The old folks, who read the land like a book, saw bad signs everywhere. They said the woods themselves seemed to hold their breath. Panthers screamed from the high ridges with an unusual frequency, their cries sounding almost human. The screech owl, the death bird of Ozark lore, was heard calling from the eaves of more than one cabin, a sound believed to foretell a coming tragedy. A sudden violent hailstorm in late March flattened the first green shoots of corn, and men looked at the bruised sky and muttered that it was a sign of God's displeasure. But the true omen wasn't in the sky or the woods. It walked on two legs and reeked of cheap whiskey. The Taylor gang and their ilk grew bolder, their crimes escalating from nighttime thievery to brazen daylight intimidation. The final straw came when one of their crew publicly horsewhipped a well-respected farmer in front of his own family over a disputed line fence. They didn't just injure the man, they humiliated him, stripping him of his dignity in the eyes of his children and neighbors. The act was a declaration: "We are the law, and your honor means nothing to us." It sent a shockwave of rage and fear through the county. This was the moment the dread became a living thing. You could see it in the eyes of men like Nat Kinney. He felt the immense pressure from his community to do something, to lead them out of the darkness. But as he looked at the hard, desperate faces of his friends and neighbors, he felt a chilling premonition. It was a gut-wrenching feeling that in order to fight the monsters who plagued their hills, they would have to become monstrous themselves. He knew that the path they were about to choose was a one-way road, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it led straight into a darkness from which none of them would ever truly return. The public humiliation of a good man was the spark that finally lit the fuse. For Nat Kinney, the time for talk was over. Word was sent out, not by letter, but by quiet visits after dark. A trusted friend would ride to a neighbor's cabin, speak a few hushed words on the porch, and then melt back into the night. The message was simple: be on the Bald Knob, east of town, after midnight. Come alone and come armed. There was no need to explain what it was about. Every man who received the summons knew in his bones that the time for choosing a side had arrived. They gathered under a cold, star-dusted sky on a treeless hill that would give them their name. They were ghosts in the moonlight, emerging from the woods in twos and threes, rifles cradled in their arms. These were not criminals. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and church-going men, their faces grim and set. At the center of the clearing, a small bonfire crackled, casting their long, dancing shadows across the barren ground. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the nervous shuffling of boots on stone. Nat Kinney stood before them, his large frame silhouetted against the flames. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout, but a low, steady rumble that carried a weight of cold fury. He spoke of the law that had abandoned them, of the thugs who terrorized their wives and children, and of the honor that was being stripped from them, piece by painful piece. "The law won't protect us," he declared, his words cutting through the night air. "So we will become the law. We will be the answer to our own prayers. We will sweep this county clean of the filth that infests it, or we will die trying." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was what they had been waiting for: a leader, a plan, a cause. Kinney had them raise their right hands, and there, in the flickering firelight, they swore a solemn oath. They swore secrecy upon pain of death. They swore loyalty to one another, and they swore to mete out justice with rope and switch to any man who threatened their homes and their peace. In that moment, they ceased to be individual farmers. They became a single entity, a phantom army born of desperation and rage. They were the Bald Knobbers, and as the men dispersed, melting back into the darkness from which they came, a new and terrible power was unleashed upon the Ozarks. They had a name, an oath, and a list of targets. Among them stood men like Ben Bolin, his hands still tingling from the oath, his mind already turning to the work ahead. He and his brothers were not thinkers like Kinney. They were doers. The first drops of blood had not yet been spilt, but the promise had been made. The hunt was about to begin, and the hills would soon echo with the sounds of their swift, brutal justice. Their justice was a terrifying ritual, repeated in dozens of darkened hollows. It always began with the sound, a low thunder that started far off and grew steadily closer. It was the sound of shod hooves, dozens of them, moving as one through the night. To the family huddled inside their cabin, it was the sound of a coming judgment. The dogs would bark themselves into a frenzy, then fall eerily silent as the phantom army surrounded the home. And then, the waiting. A silence so heavy you could feel it pressing in on the log walls. From the darkness would come a single, commanding voice, often rough and distorted by the flannel mask. "Come out, or we're coming in." Inside, a man would have to make a choice that was no choice at all. To surrender was to face the switch, the tar, the rope. To resist was to invite something far worse. This ritual of fear was the Bald Knobbers' true weapon, and for a time, it worked. They drove out the worst of the outlaws and brought a fragile, terror-enforced peace to the hills. But the night they rode on William Edens, the ritual changed. Edens was not a notorious outlaw. He was just a man who had defied them, who had spoken out against their methods. He refused to be intimidated. When the thunder of hooves surrounded his cabin and the voice called out, Edens refused to open his door. He would not surrender his home to masked men. From inside, his family heard him shout his defiance into the darkness. What happened next was not justice, it was an execution. The night didn't just splinter with the sound of a kicked-in door. It exploded in a blinding, deafening roar. A volley of rifle and shotgun fire ripped through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. To the children cowering on the floor, the world became nothing but the flash of muzzles painting terrifying momentary pictures in the dark, the scream of lead tearing through wood, and the smell of gunpowder filling their lungs. The air itself seemed to shred around them. When the shooting stopped, the silence that rushed back in was profound and absolute. Heavy boots stomped onto the porch. The remnants of the door were torn from its hinges. Through the smoke and darkness, the family saw only hulking shapes, demonic silhouettes against the moonlight, as their father was dragged from the home he had tried to defend. There was a final, terrible struggle in the yard, a woman's desperate plea cut short. Another shot rang out, sharp and final, and its echo was the only eulogy William Edens would receive. The next morning, when the neighbors arrived, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. They didn't need to see the body to understand what had happened. The cabin itself was the testament. It looked as if it had been clawed by some great furious beast. The log walls were pockmarked with dozens of dark, ugly holes, silent witnesses to the chaos. This was not a whipping. This was not a warning. This was murder, cold and brutal. On that night, the Bald Knobbers crossed a line, and in the blood of William Edens, their righteous crusade was drowned forever. The saviors had become the monsters. To understand what happened at the Edens cabin, you have to try for a moment to look through Ben Bolin's eyes. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was a surgeon, and the Ozarks were his patient, riddled with the cancer of lawlessness. A tumor doesn't have rights. You don't reason with it. You cut it out, cauterize the wound, and move on. The Taylors and their kind were the primary tumor, but men like William Edens, men who defied the cure, who obstructed the surgery, were part of the disease too. In Bolin's brutally simple logic, if you weren't actively helping to save the patient, you were helping the sickness spread. The switch didn't flip for Ben Bolin on the night of the Edens murder. It had been welded into position the moment he took the oath on that bald knob. While other men, perhaps even Kinney, saw their night riding as a temporary necessary evil, Bolin saw it as a righteous calling. He was the hammer, and it was not the hammer's place to question the nail. Each whipping, each threat, each act of terror was simply a tool for the job. He likely felt contempt for the weakness he saw in others, for the men who flinched at the sound of a switch on bare skin. They didn't have his clarity. They didn't understand that to fight monsters, you must be more terrifying than any monster. So when William Edens shouted his defiance from behind that door, Bolin didn't hear a brave man defending his home. He heard the sickness talking back. He heard a direct challenge to the new order, the only order that could save them. The hail of gunfire that shredded the cabin wasn't a moment of lost control. It was a calculated, overwhelming response to that challenge. It was a message, written in lead and smoke, not just for Edens, but for anyone else who thought they could stand in the way. This was the cold calculus of his crusade. After the final shot echoed into silence, as the other masked men stood in the shocked aftermath, Ben Bolin likely felt no remorse. He wouldn't have felt the thrill of a killer, nor the chilling emptiness of a man who has lost his soul. He would have felt the quiet, grim satisfaction of a job well done. A problem had been solved, a lesson had been taught. He was the iron fist of the bald knobbers, and that night the fist had come down hard. In his own mind, he hadn't committed a crime. He had enforced the only law that mattered. Dawn broke over the Edens homestead, but the light brought no comfort. It only served to illuminate the full scope of the horror. The silence that had followed the final gunshot was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The first neighbors to arrive walked onto the property as if treading on cursed ground. They saw the cabin first, its log walls looking like they had contracted some terrible disease, a pox of dark bullet holes. On the porch, a shattered butter churn lay on its side, a mundane casualty in a night of unimaginable violence. Inside, they found what was left of the Edens family. The widow sat on a low stool, not weeping, but staring into a space beyond the walls, her mind shattered by the events she had been forced to witness. The children were huddled together in a corner, their faces pale and streaked with soot, their eyes wide with a terror that might never leave them. But it was in the yard, lying in the cold, dew-covered dirt, that the finality of the act was laid bare. William Edens was dead, and the bald knobbers had killed him. But they had made a fatal mistake. In their furious volley, they had also shot Charles Green, Edens' son-in-law. They had left him for dead, but he wasn't. He had survived. Wounded and bleeding, he was a living witness to the slaughter. And more importantly, he had recognized some of the men behind their crude flannel masks. He knew their voices. He knew their names. His survival was a ticking clock, and with every breath he took, the bald knobber's reign of terror was 1 second closer to its end. The news of the murder didn't spread as a whisper. It tore through the Ozark Hills on a current of shock and rage. This was different from the stories of whippings and warnings. This was a line crossed in blood. The story reached the courthouse in Forsyth, and from there it traveled by telegraph to the state capitol. The tale of the bullet-riddled cabin and the defiant man murdered in front of his family was so brutal, so brazen, that the state of Missouri could no longer afford to look the other way. The law, which had been a distant rumor for so long, finally awoke with a vengeance. The governor authorized the militia. Warrants were drawn up, bearing the names of the most prominent bald knobbers, including Nat Kinney and the Bolin brothers. A substantial reward was offered for their capture, dead or alive. The official documents went up on posts and walls in every town, turning the masked riders from a secret society into a list of wanted men. The hunters had become the hunted. The murder of William Edens split Taney County down the middle like an axe splitting a log. There was no more middle ground, no room for quiet neutrality. You were either for the nobbers or against them, and you had to choose a side right now. The pot-bellied stove at the general store, once a place for shared stories and friendly gossip, now radiated a cold silence. Men who had known each other since childhood would now pass on the road with a curt nod, their eyes hard, each wondering if the other had been among the masked riders that night. The church itself was divided, with some praying for the souls of the vigilantes and others praying for their swift damnation. From the ashes of this division, an opposing force rose up, calling themselves the anti-bald nobbers. They were not lawmen. They were the friends and family of men who had been wronged by the nobbers, joined by those who were simply horrified by the Edens killing. They armed themselves and swore their own oaths, promising to hunt down the vigilantes and deliver a justice of their own. The old Civil War feud was reborn, but this time without uniforms. It was neighbor against neighbor once more, and the hills became a checkerboard of loyalty and hate, where taking the wrong path or trusting the wrong person could get a man killed. A thick, suffocating fear settled over the county, creating a conspiracy of silence. Many people knew the truth. They had seen the riders gather, heard the boasts in a saloon, or recognized a man's horse tied up outside the Edens place. But the bald nobbers' power, even when they were fugitives, was immense. Their kin were everywhere, and the threat of a burning barn or a midnight visit was far more immediate than the protection of a distant law. When the sheriff and his deputies came asking questions, men would suddenly suffer from bad memories, their eyes cast down to the floorboards. To speak the truth was an act of incredible courage, because everyone knew the nobbers had a very simple law for informants. Amidst this climate of fear, small acts of profound courage and startling cowardice played out in the shadows. One neighbor, at great risk to his own family, would leave a basket of bread and salted pork on the Edens widow's porch before dawn, a silent gesture of support. But another man, bound by blood or fear, would stand before a magistrate and provide a false alibi for his cousin, swearing he was playing cards with him on the night of the murder. The community was tearing itself apart at the seams, its moral fabric tested and frayed. It was in this fractured, paranoid landscape that the real hunt for Ben Bolin and his brothers would have to begin. While the official law, the state militia, and the county sheriff made a great show of organizing and searching, they were outsiders. They knew the main roads, but they didn't know the hollows. But the real hunters, the men who moved with a purpose that was colder and sharper than any legal duty, were the anti-bald nobbers. These were men who had lived in the shadow of the nobbers' terror. They weren't hunting for a reward, they were hunting for revenge. And they knew the mountains just as well as the men they were chasing. For months, Ben Bolin and his brothers were ghosts. They slipped through the deep woods and limestone caves they had known since childhood, a landscape that was now both their sanctuary and their cage. They reverted to a primal existence, living off poached deer and foraged nuts, their clothes turning to rags. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They tasted paranoia in every bite of squirrel meat and felt it in the cold dampness of the caves where they slept. The familiar woods, the kingdom they once ruled with masked terror, had become a labyrinthine prison. The hunt was a slow, methodical strangulation. The anti-bald nobbers were patient. They had men among them who could track a single man across solid rock and read a broken twig like a page in a book. They moved in small, quiet groups, checking the remote cabins of known sympathizers, finding the faint traces of a recent campfire, and slowly, painstakingly, tightening the net. A farmer who gave the Bolins a slice of cornbread might find his fence cut the next week, a quiet message that help was no longer an option. The fugitive's world shrank with every passing day. The end for Ben Bolin came not in a hail of bullets, but in a moment of exhaustion. It was February 1889, and the cold had gnawed at him for months. He had risked getting close to his brother's cabin, perhaps seeking a moment of warmth, a real meal, a sliver of the life he had lost. It was a fatal mistake. A tracker for the anti-bald knobber posse had found his trail in the thin layer of snow. They didn't storm the cabin. They simply waited, melting into the grey woods, becoming part of the landscape. When Bolin stepped outside, perhaps to fetch water or check the perimeter, he was allowed to walk 20 yards into the clearing. Then, a single voice cut through the cold air. "That's far enough, Ben." He froze. From behind every large oak and limestone outcrop, a man rose, rifle already at his shoulder. There was no shouting, no chaos, just the quiet final click of a dozen rifle hammers being pulled back. In that instant, Ben Bolin, the enforcer, the Iron Fist, saw the faces of his neighbors, his enemies, and knew that his war was over. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, a gaunt, tired man surrounded by the cold, unforgiving justice of the hills he once ruled. There would be no judge in a black robe for Ben Bolin. There would be no clever lawyers arguing points of law, no jury of his peers weighing evidence in a dusty box. The men who captured him, the anti-bald knobbers, had seen what passed for justice in the Ozarks. They had seen how a well-connected man could intimidate witnesses, how a sympathetic jury could ignore facts, how the slow, clumsy machine of the law could let a monster slip through its gears. They didn't trust it. They believed that to bring a man like Ben Bolin into a courtroom would be to mock the memory of William Edens. They had decided in the cold silence of the woods that Bolin would face a different kind of court. His trial was the long, grim ride from the place of his capture to a sturdy white oak tree on the side of a lonely road. The woods were his courtroom, the pale moonlight his only illumination. The jury was the silent procession of armed men on horseback who rode beside and behind him, their faces set like stone. There was no testimony offered, no evidence presented, because in their minds the case had been proven long ago, in the bullet holes of the Edens cabin, in the terrorized eyes of his family, and in the arrogance of the masked crusade Bolin had helped lead. Through it all, Ben Bolin remained unbroken. He did not beg for his life or plead for mercy. Accounts passed down through the generations say he sat tall in the saddle, his hands bound tight behind him, his gaze fixed straight ahead. His silence was his final act of defiance. He had lived his life by a code of brutal, unforgiving strength, and he would not abandon it in the face of death. He looked at the hard faces of his captors, not with fear, but with a quiet, burning contempt. He was a wolf cornered by hounds, and he would grant them no satisfaction. The verdict was delivered without a single word being spoken. When the posse stopped under the thick, bare limbs of the oak tree, the judgment was clear. They didn't grant him a final prayer or a chance for last words. The justice they dispensed was as swift and impersonal as the justice he had once delivered with a hickory switch. The rough hemp of the rope was thrown over a branch. The noose, tied with an efficient knot, was slipped over his head and cinched tight against his neck. A sharp slap on the rump of his horse, and it was over. Ben Bolin, the Iron Fist of the bald knobbers, was executed by the very vigilante justice he had championed. The question that hangs in the air, even to this day, is a chilling one. Was this justice? Or was it just another murder, another link in an endless chain of Ozark violence? The anti-bald knobbers had rid the world of a man they saw as a tyrant, but in doing so, they had become a mob, acting as their own judge, jury, and executioner. For the other captured bald knobbers, the official law would have its day in the Forsyth courthouse. But for Ben Bolin, the verdict had already been rendered, not by the law of men, but by the cold, hard law of the mountains. Ben Bolin's death was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of a chapter written in rope and vengeance. The consequences of the Bald Knobber War continued to ripple through the hills for years, leaving behind a landscape of broken lives and bitter silence. For the survivors of the Edens family, the mountains that had been their home became a prison of memory. Every creek, every ridge, every shadow held a piece of the horror they had endured. They could not rebuild their lives on ground soaked with their own blood and grief. Sometime after the trials, they packed what little they had left, turned their backs on Taney County, and vanished, seeking a place where the name Edens didn't echo with tragedy. For the other captured Bald Knobbers, the law of men finally arrived in Forsyth. The trial was a spectacle, the biggest in the county's history. And in May of 1889, 3 men, Dave Walker, his son William, and John Matthews, were led to a specially built gallows in the courthouse square. Before a crowd of thousands, they paid the ultimate price, their public execution serving as the state's final, brutal statement that the reign of the masked riders was over. But for the dozens of other knobbers who were acquitted or never charged, their freedom was a curse of its own. They walked out of the courtroom not into the arms of a grateful community, but into a life sentence of suspicion and contempt. These men, who had once been the secret kings of the night, now lived as pariahs in the daylight. Neighbors who had once feared them now simply shunned them. Their businesses failed, their crops seemed to wither on the vine, and they were met with the justice of cold shoulders and closed doors. They were haunted men, forever looking over their shoulders, wondering if every stranger on the road was a relative of someone they had wronged. Some stories say a few of them met quiet, untimely ends years later. A hunting accident, a fall from a bluff, accidents that no one ever questioned too closely. They had escaped the hangman's noose, only to find a slower, colder justice waiting for them in the unforgiving memory of their neighbors. And so, the community, exhausted by hate and bloodshed, made a collective, unspoken decision to forget. The name Bald Knobber became a curse, a word not to be spoken aloud. The grotesque horned masks were burned in secret, the records of their meetings buried or destroyed. Parents stopped telling their children the full bloody story, opting instead for a vague tale of troubles in the old days. They tried to plow over the history, to plant a new crop of peace and pretend the soil beneath wasn't filled with bones. They wrapped the entire saga in a thick blanket of silence, hoping that if they didn't speak its name, the monster they had created would finally die. The forced silence that fell over Taney County could never last. A story this soaked in blood has a way of seeping back up through the ground. Walk through the Ozark Hills today, and you will still find the old names, Bolin, Kinney, Taylor, on mailboxes and in the phone book. The descendants of the riders and their enemies now share pews in the same churches and shop in the same stores. The blood feud is long over, the wounds scabbed over by generations of peace. But the echo remains. To carry one of those names is to carry a piece of that violent history, a faint whisper of a time when your great-grandfather might have been either the masked man on the horse or the one bolting his door in fear. The physical scars on the land have faded more slowly. For decades, the white oak where Ben Bolin was lynched stood as a dark monument on the side of the road. Locals knew it as the Bolin tree, and it became a place of dread, a landmark to be passed quickly, especially after dark. It was said that nothing would grow in its shadow. Eventually, time and nature did what the community could not. The old tree withered, died, and was cut down, its wood likely burned to ash. But even today, the old-timers can still point to the exact spot where it stood. The tree is gone, but the ground remembers. In the town of Forsyth, the old courthouse where the other knobbers were tried is gone, replaced by a new one. But in the local cemetery, you can find the graves of the 3 men who were legally hanged. Their tombstones are simple, weathered by 100 Missouri winters, giving no hint of the spectacle of their deaths. They are quiet, stone reminders of a time when the law finally brought its terrible, formal power to bear on the chaos. But the most powerful remnant of Ben Bowlin isn't made of wood or stone, it is the ghost story. As the facts were buried under the community's silence, the man was replaced by the myth. History became folklore. To this day, on the dark roads around where he was killed, people still tell stories of the Phantom Rider, a lone, gaunt figure on horseback, seen on moonless nights, forever repeating his last fatal ride. Ben Bowlin the man is dead and gone, but Ben Bowlin the spectre became immortal, a cautionary tale whispered to children to keep them from straying too far into the woods after dark. The people tried to forget, but the story simply refused to die. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the very beginning, a question that has haunted these hills for over a century. Was Ben Bowlin a righteous crusader who lost his way? Or was he a brutal killer who simply found the right mask to wear? The honest truth, buried under years of myth and silence, is that he was both. He was the inevitable and terrible answer to the chaos that surrounded him. He was a man forged in the crucible of a lawless land, and he became the very thing he sought to destroy. The story of Ben Bowlin is the story of a cure that becomes its own disease. This is more than just a tale of Ozark vigilantes. It is a timeless warning about the desperate hunger for order and the terrible price that is sometimes paid to achieve it. It is the story of what happens when good, frightened men, abandoned by the law, decide to walk the razor's edge between justice and vengeance, only to lose their balance and fall into the abyss. The bald knobbers rose from the dirt to give their community hope, but their legacy is a stark reminder that a society's saviors can all too easily become its tyrants, and that a revolution born of righteousness will almost always end by eating its own. And so the story returns to the darkness, to a lonely road and the sound of a single horse. The ghost of Ben Bowlin isn't just a campfire tale meant to scare children. He is the restless spirit of this lesson. He is a permanent warning, etched into the very landscape, a silent testament to a brutal truth. In a land without law, the man who promises to save you from the monsters is often the first one to become a monster himself. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Imagine this for a moment. A 10-year-old boy and his 7-year-old sister, barefoot and bleeding, crashing through the Appalachian wilderness. In the boy's arms is a crying infant. They are the only thing left of their family. Behind them, in the chilling silence that always follows the screams, lies the ruin of their home and the bodies of their father and their 7 brothers. How does a family get wiped from the face of the earth in a single afternoon, leaving only children to tell the tale? The history books call it the Hannon family massacre, just another bloody footnote in the story of the American frontier. But that simple label hides a far darker and more complex truth. It hides the story of a forgotten war, of a visionary warrior fighting for his people's survival, and of a clash of worlds so violent it left ghosts that are said to haunt these mountains to this very day. Today, we journey back to that brutal summer of 1776 to find out what really happened on the day hell descended into a quiet mountain hollow. Before the screams, there was the quiet rhythm of a life being carved out of the wilderness. William Hannon's homestead was little more than a notch in the vast green cloak of the North Carolina mountains. A log cabin, sturdy and rough-hewn, stood in a small clearing, a testament to endless hours of labor. Around it, a field of corn and beans fought a daily battle against the encroaching forest. This was the frontier in 1776, not a place of grand adventure, but of grueling, back-breaking work from sunup to sundown. The forest was both a provider and a threat. It gave them timber for their home, game for their table, and cool water from its creeks. But it also held its secrets in a deep, watchful silence. William Hannon was a man defined by that silence. A widower, he was the sole guardian of 10 children, a responsibility that would have crushed a lesser man. His 5 eldest sons were already turning into men themselves, their hands calloused from the axe and the plough. They worked beside their father in the fields, their shared sweat watering the very ground they hoped to one day call their own. They weren't invaders in their own minds. They were builders, planters, men chasing the simple, universal dream of leaving something behind for their children. Inside the cabin, life was a hum of smaller chores. 10-year-old Edwin was already learning the weight of responsibility, while his 7-year-old sister Winnie was more mother than child to the 2 toddlers and the new baby, Elizabeth. Their world was small, bounded by the edge of the woods and the arc of the sun. Their joys were simple: a cool drink of water after a hot day's work, the rare taste of wild honey, the stories told by the firelight as the mountains outside grew dark and quiet. It was a hard life, but it was their life, whole and unbroken. But the year was 1776, and while men in Philadelphia were debating the birth of a new nation, the world these settlers knew was on the verge of a violent, bloody death. The winds of revolution that blew through the cities reached the mountains as distorted whispers, rumors carried by traders and traveling preachers. They spoke of war with the British, of independence, of freedom, words that felt distant and abstract in a place where survival was the only law that mattered. The more immediate danger had a name that was beginning to be spoken with a mix of fear and reluctant respect: Dragging Canoe. He was the leader of the Chickamauga Cherokee, a man who refused to bow to the white tide. Whispers said he had sworn a blood oath to drive the settlers from his ancestral lands. The Hannon family, in their quiet hollow, knew of these rumors. Every snap of a twig in the forest, every unfamiliar shadow at dusk, was a reminder that their small patch of cleared land was an island in an ocean of ancient history they did not understand. They were living on borrowed time, and they had no idea the debt was about to be called due. The Hannons had no quarrel with their immediate neighbors. On the frontier, you relied on the folks in the next valley over. No, the grudges that doomed them were older, deeper, and written on the land itself. William Hannon and his family were living on the edge of a wound that had been festering for decades. Each treaty signed by distant chiefs, each parcel of land ceded under pressure, was another drop of poison in the well. To the Cherokee, the settlers' cabins weren't homes. They were markers of a slow, creeping death to their way of life. The architect of this simmering rage was Dragging Canoe. He was a man who saw the future in the tired eyes of the old chiefs who kept giving away land, hoping for a peace that never came. At a treaty meeting, as yet another swath of ancestral hunting ground was signed over, he pointed to the land and spoke words that would become a prophecy written in blood. "You have bought a beautiful land," he told the settlers, "but I am afraid that you will find its settlement dark and bloody." He saw no compromise, only oblivion. Dragging Canoe and his followers, the Chickamauga, were not just a band of renegades. They were the hardened soul of the Cherokee resistance. They saw the American Revolution not as a fight for freedom, but as a chaotic opportunity. British agents, eager to sow terror on the colonial frontier, fanned the flames of their fury. They provided guns, ammunition, and promises, turning the Chickamauga's righteous anger into a weapon. For Dragging Canoe, this wasn't about fighting for the British king. It was a holy war for the mountains themselves. This web of intrigue and old hatreds created an atmosphere thick with paranoia. In the scattered settlements, rumors spread like wildfire. A hunter would report seeing unfamiliar tracks by the creek. A trader would bring news of Chickamauga war parties gathering in the hidden valleys. Whispers turned to warnings, and warnings turned to cold, hard fear. The Hannon family, like every other settler, would have felt it. The friendly waves they might have once exchanged with Cherokee hunters were gone, replaced by wary, assessing stares across the trees. The air itself had changed. It was no longer just the quiet of the mountains. It was the tense, listening silence before a storm. The point of no return wasn't a shouted argument or a line drawn in the dirt. It was a silent decision made in the deep shadows of the forest. It was the moment a Chickamauga war party, their faces painted in the colors of vengeance, began to move with purpose toward the smell of wood smoke from the Hannon cabin. For them, this wasn't murder. It was surgery. It was cutting out a cancer that was killing their world, one small homestead at a time. Every snapped twig under their moccasins was a drumbeat of inevitability. On the other side of that thin veil of trees, life continued in blissful ignorance. It was a hot, heavy summer afternoon. William Hannon and his 5 oldest boys were in the field, likely bent over their work, their backs slick with sweat. The rhythmic thud of a hoe against the earth, the drone of insects in the thick air, these were the sounds of their world. Their rifles, the essential tools of frontier survival, were likely propped against a stump at the edge of the clearing. In the quiet rhythm of their labor, the danger that had been a whisper for months had faded to a dull background hum. This was the fatal miscalculation of the frontier, the belief that because the morning was peaceful, the afternoon would be too. The Hannon men were tired, focused on the soil, their senses lulled by the heat. They didn't see the flicker of movement in the tree line. They didn't hear the collective intake of breath as dozens of eyes fixed on them from the shadows. The war party had reached the edge of the woods. They could see the unsuspecting figures in the field, see the faint outline of the cabin beyond. There was no turning back now. The promise made to Dragging Canoe, the anger fueled by British guns, the generations of grief for lost lands, it all coalesced into this one irreversible moment. A hand was raised. A silent signal was given. The deep, listening silence of the Appalachian forest was about to be broken by a sound that would echo through generations. It began with a sound that didn't belong in a peaceful afternoon. It wasn't the call of a bird or the snap of a twig, but the chilling, high-pitched war cry of the Chickamauga erupting from the tree line. For William Hannon and his 5 sons, there was no time to run, no time to even turn and grab their rifles. The world of hoeing and planting vanished in an instant, replaced by a storm of motion and violence that swept over the field. It wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. Moments later, it was over. The rhythmic sounds of work had been replaced by a silence that was heavy and absolute. 6 men who had been toiling under the sun were now part of the very earth they had been turning. From the cabin, one could only see the aftermath, the still figures lying in the dirt and the attackers moving among them. One warrior stood over the body of William Hannon and with a swift, practiced motion raised a dark, bloody proof of his victory to the sky before disappearing back into the shadows of the forest. Inside the cabin, the screams from the field had been cut short, leaving a ringing void that was even more terrifying. 10-year-old Edwin and 7-year-old Winnie huddled together, trying to quiet the 2 toddlers and the crying infant, Elizabeth. Then came a new sound, the splintering of their own front door. It burst inward, and the small, dim cabin was suddenly filled with huge, terrifying shadows. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat, rage, and something metallic that the children didn't understand. The warriors' eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the forest, scanned the cabin. They saw the children. In the merciless logic of a war for survival, these were not children. They were the seeds of their enemy, seeds that could not be allowed to grow. One of the warriors moved toward the 3-year-old boy, who was crying in terror. There was a small, sharp scream, followed by a sickeningly dull thud against the log wall, and then silence. The newborn, Elizabeth, began to wail, her infant cries filling the cabin. Another warrior moved toward her. But in that moment, in that bloody, chaotic frenzy, something happened. Perhaps the warriors were spooked by a sound. Perhaps they believed their work was done and were eager to leave. For one critical second, their attention was diverted. It was all the time the universe would give. It wasn't a thought. but a pure animal instinct that moved 10-year-old Edwin. As the warrior turned away, the boy lunged, scooping the screaming infant from her cradle. He grabbed Winnie's hand, pulling her with a force she didn't know he possessed. He didn't look back at the small, still form of his little brother. He didn't look at anything but the gaping hole where the door used to be. They slipped out of the cabin like two small ghosts leaving their own grave. Barefoot, with a screaming baby in their arms, they ran. They didn't run toward the fields where their father lay. They ran for the one place that had always seemed so dark and threatening, the only place that now offered salvation, the deep, silent woods. They plunged into the shadows, the thorny branches tearing at their skin, running from the silence that had just fallen over their home, a silence now more terrifying than any scream. For what felt like an eternity, Edwin and Winnie ran, fueled by a terror that numbed the pain of thorns and sharp rocks under their bare feet. The only reality was the weight of the baby in Edwin's arms and the desperate, ragged sound of their own breathing. They finally stumbled out of the tree line and into the clearing of the nearest farmstead, collapsing in a heap of exhaustion and shock. They were a horrifying sight. Two children covered in scratches, their eyes wide with a horror no words could yet explain, and a wailing infant. But the message they brought didn't need words. It was carried in their silence and their tears. Within the hour, a grim-faced party of neighbors, rifles in hand, made their way cautiously toward the Hannon homestead. The first thing they noticed was the silence. The familiar sounds of a working farm, the chop of an axe, the call of a voice were gone. All they could hear was the buzzing of flies in the oppressive summer heat. They found William and his sons in the field, lying where they had fallen, the earth around them stained a dark, terrible color. The scene spoke of a swift, merciless violence that left no room for a fight. The men's faces hardened as they approached the cabin. The door hung broken on its hinges, a gaping wound in the side of the small home. Inside was a scene of profound violation. The simple furniture was overturned, and in the dim light they saw what the children had fled from. The overturned cradle, the small, still body of the 3-year-old boy. It was a sight that burned itself into the minds of even the most hardened frontiersmen, turning their fear into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The surviving children were taken in, passed from one set of gentle, grieving hands to another. But they were no longer the children they had been that morning. They were ghosts, haunted by what they had seen and heard. Winnie clung to the infant Elizabeth as if the baby were the last anchor in a world that had been washed away by a flood of violence. Edwin, the 10-year-old boy who had saved them, retreated into a silent, watchful place deep within himself. His eyes held the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and had seen the abyss stare back. The news of the massacre traveled like a shockwave through the scattered settlements of the North Carolina frontier. It was a story told in hushed, terrified whispers around hearths that night. Doors were barred, rifles were loaded, and every shadow in the woods became a source of terror. The fragile illusion of safety was shattered. Dragging Canoe was no longer a distant rumor. He was a tangible, blood-soaked threat who had reached into their world and ripped a family apart. Fear was the first reaction. But in the heart of the Appalachian settler, fear was always followed by something else, a burning, unquenchable thirst for vengeance. The hunt began not with a sheriff's decree, but with a low growl of fury that rippled through the scattered cabins. As the bodies of the Hannons were being prepared for their final rest in the hard Appalachian soil, the men of the frontier were gathering. They came with their long rifles, powder horns, and a quiet, murderous resolve in their eyes. These weren't lawmen, they were farmers, blacksmiths, and trappers whose hands were as accustomed to an axe handle as a trigger. The massacre wasn't an attack on a stranger, it was an attack on every single one of them, on their wives, their children, their own precarious existence. They formed a ragged posse, a grim collection of about 20 men, and plunged into the forest on the trail of the war party. They were skilled woodsmen, men who could read a bent twig or a scuffed patch of moss like a page in a book. But the mountains that had been their home now became an alien landscape, a deadly labyrinth that belonged to their enemy. Every ravine could hide an ambush, every thicket of rhododendron a sniper. The air, thick with humidity, was also thick with a palpable tension that made the sweat on their necks run cold. For days, they pushed deeper into the wilderness, their initial rage sharpening into a focused, exhausting pursuit. They found signs of the war party's passage, the remains of a hastily eaten meal, a single dropped feather from a ceremonial dress, a faint moccasin print in the mud of a creek bed. Each discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through the weary men, pulling them onward. They were close. They could feel it. They slept in shifts, their rifles never leaving their hands, their dreams filled with shadows and the ghost of a child's scream. But the Chickamauga were masters of this domain. They moved like smoke through the trees, their trail growing fainter and more confusing with every mile. The posse would follow a clear path for hours, only to have it vanish completely on a rocky ridge, as if the warriors had simply been lifted into the sky. The mountains were helping their own. The forest that had provided the Hannans with life was now actively shielding their killers, swallowing them into its vast green depths. The moment of capture never came. After a week of relentless pursuit, the posse stood on a high bluff, looking out over an endless expanse of ridges and valleys. They were gaunt, their supplies were dwindling, and their tracks were the only ones they had seen for 2 days. The grim truth settled upon them like a shroud. The war party had dissolved back into the wilderness, swallowed by a network of hidden paths and sympathetic villages they could never hope to find. There was no fierce firefight, no exhausted surrender. There was only the cold, bitter realization that the men they were hunting were gone. They had struck and then vanished, leaving nothing behind but corpses and terror. The posse returned to their homesteads, not with prisoners, but with a new, chilling certainty. The war had just begun, and the enemy was a ghost they could not catch. There was no trial, no courtroom, no judge in a black robe, no clever lawyers arguing points of law. To expect such things would be to misunderstand the brutal reality of the frontier in 1776. The courthouses of the new nation were far away, beyond the mountains, and their laws felt as distant and irrelevant as the king across the sea. The men who killed the Hannans were never arrested, never identified, never brought before a jury of their peers. They were simply phantoms who had emerged from the forest and returned to it. The only verdict delivered was the one declared in the hearts of the settlers. The war party that had attacked the Hannans was, in their eyes, guilty beyond any doubt. The evidence was not in testimony, but in the freshly turned earth of 9 graves on a hillside. The sentence was not imprisonment, but death. Death not just to the specific warriors who had wielded the hatchets, but to the entire idea of a shared land. The massacre became a justification, a rallying cry that hardened hearts and erased any lingering thoughts of peaceful coexistence. In the place of a formal trial, there was a trial by rumor and fire. The name of Dragging Canoe became a curse, a name synonymous with savagery and evil. Any Cherokee, whether they followed Dragging Canoe or the peace-seeking chiefs, was now viewed with suspicion and hatred. The act of a single war party was laid at the feet of an entire people. This was the justice of the mountains, swift, absolute, and unforgiving. It wasn't about finding individual culprits, it was about identifying an enemy. The lack of a formal verdict was, in its own way, the most damning verdict of all. It signified that the Hannan family lived and died in a place where the rule of law had not yet taken root. Their lives were governed by a more ancient and brutal code, the code of survival and retribution. The failure of the posse to capture the killers meant there would be no clean resolution, no moment of state-sanctioned justice to close the wound. Instead, the wound was left to fester. It fueled a cycle of retaliatory raids and counter-raids that would stain the Appalachian soil with blood for another 2 decades. A brutal, undeclared war where every man was his own judge, jury, and executioner. What became of the children who ran from a cabin of ghosts? They survived, but they never truly escaped that summer afternoon. They grew up in the shadow of that day, carrying a silence that others could not understand. Legends in these mountains say that Edwin, the boy who had to become a man in a matter of seconds, grew into a hard, quiet frontiersman whose eyes were always scanning the tree line. He was a man forever at war with the memory of what he had lost. Winnie and Elizabeth, the sister and the infant she helped save, grew to become wives and mothers themselves. They built new families, and their bloodline continues to this day, woven into the fabric of Appalachia. But those who knew them said there was always a sadness that never quite left their eyes, a memory of a lullaby that ended in a scream. If you were to go looking for the Hannon homestead today, you wouldn't find it. There is no preserved cabin, no historical marker by the side of the road. The forest has long since swallowed the scar of their small field. The logs of their home have rotted back into the earth from which they came. The only physical trace left is the land itself, and perhaps a few unmarked stones on a forgotten hillside, worn smooth by 2 centuries of rain and wind. But the story did not rot away with the cabin walls. It seeped into the soil like blood, becoming a part of the local folklore. For generations, people living in that hollow have spoken of strange things. They say that on quiet, moonless summer nights, if you stand near the creek where the homestead was, you can sometimes hear the faint, ghostly sound of a baby crying on the wind. It is the soul of the murdered infant, they say, forever lost between worlds. Most people have forgotten the name William Hannon. The official histories mention the event only in passing, if at all. But the mountains remember. The old oaks that witnessed the attack still stand, their rings holding the memory of that day's terrible silence. The story isn't in a book, it's in the land itself. It's a ghost story whispered to children to keep them close to home after dark, a cautionary tale about the brutal cost of a new nation. The paper may have forgotten, but the earth never does. So we return to the question that haunted us from the beginning. How does a family get wiped from the face of the earth, leaving only children to tell the tale? The easy answer is to blame the savagery of the frontier, to point a finger at Dragging Canoe and his warriors. But the truth, like the Appalachian forest itself, is a place of deep and tangled shadows. The Hannon family weren't just killed by men with hatchets. They were caught in the grinding gears of history, crushed between one people's desperate dream for a new life and another people's even more desperate struggle to save their ancient world from disappearing forever. This story is not just an account of a brutal massacre. It is a parable of how America was born. For every noble word written in the Declaration of Independence that summer, there was a silent, bloody chapter being written in a forgotten mountain hollow. It reminds us that progress is never clean, and the foundations of a new world are often laid upon the graves of the old one. The Hannons were pioneers, but they were also trespassers. The Chickamauga were defenders of their homeland, but they were also the agents of a nightmare. There are no simple heroes or villains here. There are only human beings pushed to the limits of their endurance, their fear, and their fury. The real legacy of this tragedy isn't just the ghost of a crying baby on the wind. It's in the resilience of those who survived, the children who ran from hell and somehow managed to build new lives. It is a story not just of cruelty, but of the unyielding strength of the human spirit. It is a wound on the soul of Appalachia that has never fully healed, a quiet reminder that the land we walk on is layered with stories, sorrows, and blood we have long since forgotten. The mountains hold these memories, locked away in their silent, stony heart. They remember the laughter of children in a sunlit field, the chilling war cry that shattered the peace, and the terrible silence that followed, And now, my friends, so do you. Can the dead speak? And more importantly, if they did, would anyone listen? In Greenbrier County, West Virginia, in 1897, this wasn't just a campfire tale. It became the basis for a murder trial. The official report said that a young woman named Zona Heaster had simply died of an everlasting faint. But her mother knew the truth was far darker. She swore that her daughter's spirit returned from beyond the grave to name its own killer. They say a ghost can't testify in court. But in the old mountains of Appalachia, the veil between this world and the next is paper thin. Before the whispers and the shadows, there was just Greenbrier County, a place carved out of the Appalachian Mountains where the hollows hold the morning mist like a secret and life moves with the rhythm of the seasons. It was a hard land, but an honest one. People here knew their neighbors, they knew the old stories, and they knew that some things in this world couldn't be explained by logic or law. This was the world of Zona Heaster, a young woman as vibrant and untamed as the mountains she called home. Locals just called her Zona. She was a beauty, with a spirit that refused to be broken. In a time when a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, Zona had already weathered a storm, having borne a child out of wedlock. But shame wasn't in her nature. She held her head high, her laughter echoing in the hills, a testament to a soul that craved life and love without condition. She was a daughter of these mountains, and she was looking for a future as bright as her own spirit. Then a stranger rode into town. His name was Erasmus Shue, but folks called him Trout. He was a blacksmith, strong and handsome, with a smooth way of talking that could charm a bird from a tree. He was new, a man without a past, or at least without one he was willing to share. When his eyes met Zona's, a spark ignited that was too powerful for either of them to ignore. He wasn't like the local boys. He spoke of a life beyond the confines of Greenbrier, a life filled with passion and promise. Their romance was a whirlwind, a sudden fire that burned hot and fast. Trout showered Zona with affection, painting a picture of a perfect life together. For a girl who had known hardship, his words were like a sweet melody, promising a home, a name, and a love that would protect her from the world's judgment. She was completely captivated, seeing in him not just a husband, but the fulfillment of all her dreams. But one person saw not a dream, but a nightmare. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, felt a chill every time Trout Shue was near. A mother's intuition is an ancient and powerful thing, and hers screamed that something was wrong. She saw a darkness behind his charming smile, a predator's stillness in his eyes. She warned Zona, begged her to be careful, but her daughter was blinded by the light of first love, deaf to the warnings of a woman who had learned to listen to the whispers of the mountains. In October of 1896, against her mother's wishes, Zona married Trout. They moved into a small house near the blacksmith shop, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed like Zona's dream had come true. She was Mrs. Shue, a wife with a home and a future. But the Appalachian winter was closing in, long and cold, and a darkness far deeper than the winter nights was gathering over that little house. The dream of a happy life, built so quickly, shattered just as fast. The Appalachian winter had settled deep into the bones of the mountains, but on January 23, 1897, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran through Greenbrier County. It had been only 3 months since the wedding. A young boy, sent by Trout Shue on an errand to his home, found a scene of shocking stillness. Zona was lying at the bottom of the stairs, lifeless. The boy ran, his feet pounding the frozen earth, his heart hammering against his ribs, carrying the terrible news back to town. By the time help arrived, led by the local doctor George Knapp, the scene was already changed. Trout Shue had carried his wife's body upstairs and laid her on their bed. He was wild with a grief that seemed too loud, too performative. He threw himself upon her, his sobs echoing through the small house, creating a wall of sound and sorrow that kept everyone at a distance. He was a man drowning in despair, or so it seemed. The doctor, faced with a hysterical husband and no obvious signs of a struggle, could only do so much. But as the community gathered to prepare for the funeral, Trout's behavior grew stranger, more controlling. Now, in those days, preparing a body for burial was a sacred ritual performed by family and female neighbors. It was a final act of care and respect. But Trout refused to let anyone touch his wife. He insisted on dressing Zona himself, a task he performed alone behind a closed door. When he was done, she was presented in her finest dress, a beautiful garment with one very peculiar feature, a high, stiff collar that reached all the way to her chin. As if the collar weren't enough, Trout then wrapped a large scarf around her neck, explaining tearfully that it had been her favorite. In the coffin, her head seemed oddly loose, and he propped it up with pillows on either side. Any time a mourner came close to pay their respects, to touch her hand or adjust the pillows, Trout would fly into a rage, his grief turning instantly to aggression. He hovered over the head of the coffin, weeping and wailing, physically shielding her neck from view. The whispers started then. People had seen grief before, but this was different. This felt like a man guarding a secret. Knapp, influenced by Trout's frantic behavior and the lack of an autopsy, recorded the official cause of death as an everlasting faint. He later amended it to complications from childbirth, trying to find a medical reason for such a sudden tragedy. With a doctor's signature on the certificate, there were no more questions to be asked, at least not by the law. Zona Shue was buried in the local cemetery, her high collar and scarf intact. The cold earth covered the coffin, the case was closed, and a terrible secret was seemingly buried forever. For the town of Greenbrier, the story was over. A tragedy, yes, but a closed chapter. For Mary Jane Heaster, however, the real story was just beginning. In the dead quiet of her home, her daughter's absence was a deafening roar. Grief gnawed at her, but beneath it was a cold, hard certainty. Zona had not just died. She had been taken. Mary Jane prayed, not for comfort, but for truth. She begged for a sign, any sign, to prove what her heart already knew. And in the deep, silent nights of that Appalachian winter, her prayers were answered. It started with a cold. Not the kind that seeps in from a drafty window, but a cold that rose from the floorboards, a deathly chill that settled deep in her bones. For 4 nights in a row, the same thing happened. The room would grow frigid, and a faint light would begin to glow in the darkness, coalescing into the form of her daughter, Zona. She wasn't a terrifying specter, but a figure of profound sadness, her form shimmering like moonlight through mist, her eyes pleading. And then she spoke, her voice like the rustle of frozen leaves. The ghost of Zona told a story that made her mother's blood run cold. She spoke of Trout Shue, not as the charming blacksmith the town knew, but as a man of sudden, violent tempers. On that final evening, his rage had ignited over something as simple as the evening meal. He had come home expecting meat for dinner, and when he found there was none, a storm broke inside their little house. It was an argument, like many couples have, but it was laced with a darkness that Zona had come to fear. Her daughter's spirit recounted the final horrifying moments. The argument escalated, and in a flash of fury, Trout grabbed her. The ghost didn't speak of a struggle, it spoke of a sudden, brutal finality. She told her mother that he had clamped his hands around her neck, his rage giving him an inhuman strength. Then came the part of the vision that would be seared into Mary Jane's mind forever. To show her mother exactly what had happened, the spirit of Zona slowly turned its head. It turned and turned, past the point where a living neck could go, all the way around, until a faint, dry snap echoed in the silent room, a sound that was the final punctuation mark on her daughter's life. The apparition explained everything. It explained why her head was so loose in the coffin, why Trout had propped it with pillows. It explained the high, stiff collar and the carefully placed scarf. They were all meant to hide the terrible truth of his hands. For 4 nights, the ghost returned, telling the same story, reinforcing the same horrible details, until Mary Jane was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a witness. She was the keeper of a testimony delivered from the other side of the veil, and she knew she could not stay silent. When the 4th night passed, and the ghost of her daughter did not return, a new kind of silence fell over Mary Jane Heaster's home. It was no longer the silence of grief, but the heavy silence of purpose. The story her daughter's spirit had shared was now a weight in her soul, a truth she had to carry out into the world of the living. She knew how it would sound. A woman, already half mad with sorrow, telling tales of a visitor from the grave. They would call her a fool, or worse, a liar. But the image of Zona's head turning, the ghostly echo of that final, terrible sound, it gave her a courage that no amount of ridicule could shake. With a resolve as hard as the frozen Appalachian ground, she went to the county prosecutor, John Alfred Preston. You can just imagine the scene. A man of law and logic, sitting behind a desk piled with earthly matters, suddenly confronted by a woman whose chief witness was a ghost. Preston listened, his expression unreadable, as Mary Jane recounted the 4 nights of visitations. She didn't flinch or falter, describing the icy cold, the shimmering light, and the horrifying story that came with it. On its face, the story was unbelievable, the kind of mountain folklore that had no place in a courtroom. But Preston was a thoughtful man, and he remembered the whispers that had followed Zona's funeral. He remembered the reports of Trout Shoe's bizarre, possessive grief. He remembered the high collar and the scarf. Mary Jane's tale, as wild as it was, provided a chilling explanation for all of it. It was a single strange key for a lock no one else could open. Her story wasn't just a vision, it was a theory of the crime that made perfect, terrible sense. Risking his career and his reputation, Preston made a decision. He would listen to the ghost. He went back to Dr. Knapp and, armed with Mary Jane's conviction, persuaded him that something was deeply wrong. An order was given for the exhumation of Zona Heaster Shoe. On February 22, 1897, a small group of men stood in the cold silence of the cemetery. The work was grim, the sound of shovels striking frozen earth a violation of the peace. They raised the coffin, and in a makeshift autopsy room, the truth was finally brought into the light. The high collar and scarf were removed, and there, on Zona's neck, was the proof. Bruises, shaped like fingerprints, were still visible on her skin. Dr. Knapp's examination was thorough this time. He found that her windpipe had been crushed, and then he felt her neck. The first and second vertebrae were dislocated. Her neck had been broken. Every single detail from the ghost's testimony was now cold, undeniable, physical fact. The whispers of a ghost had led them to the evidence. The law, which had been so quick to close the case, now moved with swift and terrible purpose. The charm and the tears of Erasmus Trout Shoe were now meaningless. He was no longer the tragic widower. He was the monster from his dead wife's story. The manhunt was short because the culprit had been hiding in plain sight all along. Trout Shoe was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. The trial of Trout Shoe became a sensation. Word of the Greenbrier ghost spread through the mountains like wildfire, drawing crowds to the courthouse in Lewisburg. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was a spectacle, a clash between the modern world of law and the ancient world of mountain belief. The courtroom was packed, a sea of faces, some hungry for justice, others just hungry for a good story. Prosecutor Preston had a strong case built on the solid scientific evidence of the autopsy. He had the broken neck, the crushed windpipe, the bruises. He had the facts. But he knew the heart of the story, The thing that had brought them all here was Mary Jane Heaster's spectral visitor. The defense attorney, on the other hand, saw Mary Jane as his greatest asset. He believed her story was so outlandish, so patently insane, that he could use it to discredit the entire investigation. He thought he could paint her as an unreliable, hysterical woman whose grief had pushed her into delusion. He planned to make a mockery of her testimony and, by extension, the entire prosecution. It was a fatal miscalculation. When Mary Jane took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. The defense attorney began his cross-examination, his tone dripping with condescension. He asked her about the ghost, expecting her to become flustered, to contradict herself, to crumble under the pressure of the court's scrutiny. He asked if the ghost's feet were bare. He asked what she was wearing. He asked if she spoke in a whisper. He was trying to catch her in a lie. But Mary Jane Heaster did not crumble. With an unshakable calm and a sincerity that was spellbinding, she answered every question. She looked directly at the jury, 12 men of the mountains who understood a world that wasn't always visible to the naked eye. She told them, under oath, about the 4 nights her daughter came to her. Her testimony was filled with the small, human details that make a story real. Her voice never wavered. She was not a mad woman. She was a mother, delivering a message. The attorney's strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of making her look foolish, he had given her the stage to tell her incredible story to the jury, who listened, captivated. Her testimony had a profound effect. While the ghost's testimony was not officially entered as evidence, it filled the courtroom with a truth that was more powerful than any legal document. It gave the cold, clinical facts of the autopsy a voice and a motive. It explained why a man would act so strangely at a funeral, why he would cover his wife's neck with such care. The jury looked at Trout Shue, sitting defiant and smirking at the defendant's table, and they saw him not just through the eyes of the law, but through the eyes of Zona's ghost. On July 11, 1897, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Erasmus Trout Shue was sentenced to life in prison. The law of man had delivered its justice, but everyone in that courtroom knew it had been guided by a justice from somewhere else entirely. Trout Shue, the charming blacksmith, was sent to the state penitentiary in Moundsville, where he died just 3 years later, taking whatever was left of his secrets with him to the grave. The slam of the prison gate on Trout Shue was not the end of this story. In fact, once he was safely behind bars, the truth he had hidden for so long began to seep out like poison from a wound. Investigators, prompted by the sensational trial, started digging into his past. It turned out Zona wasn't his first wife, or even his second. A dark, terrifying pattern began to emerge. His first wife had divorced him, citing extreme and brutal cruelty. His second wife had died just a year into their marriage under circumstances that now seemed chillingly familiar, a sudden, mysterious fall. The mountains had been sheltering a predator for years. The ghost of Zona Heaster hadn't just sought justice for herself. Her voice from the grave had unmasked a man who was likely a serial abuser and murderer, a man who had used his charm to lure women to their deaths, confident that the isolation of these hills would keep his secrets buried. His conviction wasn't just a victory for one family, it was a reckoning that had been a long time coming. Today, if you travel those winding West Virginia roads into Greenbrier County, you can still find the physical traces of this story. You can visit the Soul Chapel Methodist Cemetery, a quiet, humble place where Zona Heaster Shue is buried. Her tombstone stands as a silent testament to a life cut tragically short. For decades, it has been a pilgrimage site for those who know the story, a place to stand and wonder at the power of a mother's love and the thinness of the veil. But the most incredible piece of this story's legacy stands not in the cemetery, but alongside the road for all to see. It's a historical marker, the kind you see all over the country commemorating battles and births. But this one is different. cast in metal for the state of West Virginia to acknowledge forever. The plaque reads, "Interred in a nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband. An autopsy on the exhumed body verified the ghost's testimony." It ends with a sentence that still sends a shiver down the spine. The only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. The court records are filed away. The people who filled that courtroom are long gone, but the mountains remember. The story of the Greenbrier ghost has become woven into the very fabric of Appalachian folklore, a tale told around fires and on front porches. It serves as a permanent reminder that in this land of mist and shadow, some bonds are stronger than death, and some truths will find a way to be heard, even if they have to cross the threshold of the grave to do it. So we come back to the question we started with. Can the dead speak? And would we listen if they did? Skeptics will say that Mary Jane Heaster was a shrewd and desperate woman, that she cleverly took the town's whispers and her own suspicions and wove them into a ghost story, the only tool she had to force the hand of a legal system that had already dismissed her daughter's death. In a world where a woman's word meant little, perhaps the word of a ghost was the only testimony that could not be ignored. But whether you believe it was a spirit returned from the grave or the manifestation of a mother's unbreakable love, the truth that was unearthed is the same. This story isn't just about a ghost, it's about a voice that refused to be silenced. It's about the fierce, primal power of a mother's intuition in a world that often trusts only what it can see and touch. It teaches us that sometimes justice doesn't come from laws written in books, but from a truth that whispers from just beyond our understanding. The story of the Greenbrier ghost has become a permanent part of the American landscape because it speaks to a fundamental hope, that love is stronger than death, that evil will ultimately be exposed, and that even in the deepest silence, a cry for justice will find a way to be heard. It is a chilling, beautiful reminder that in the old mountains, some secrets refuse to stay buried. For 3 days, the law in Blackwater County was gone. A posse of the county's toughest men stood helpless at the mouth of the Black Hole, a jagged moor in the mountainside that seemed to breathe a cold older than memory. They were waiting for one man, Sheriff Banquo Fletcher, who had walked into that absolute darkness 3 days prior, hunting a killer the rest of them were too terrified to pursue. Now, silence was their only answer. Did the legendary lawman finally meet his match? Not in a man, but in the earth itself. Today, we go back to that moment of terrifying uncertainty to uncover the truth of the man who walked into a legend and came back forever changed. The 2 men who died weren't just company guards, they were Blackwater County men. The first was Thomas Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of his 50 years in the mines. His hands were thick with calluses, but they were gentle with his grandchildren. He'd taken the guard job to get out of the deep shafts, hoping for a few quiet years before he retired. The second was David Eames, barely 20 years old, with a quick smile and eyes full of plans to marry his sweetheart and buy a small plot of land downriver. They weren't heroes or gunslingers. They were just ordinary men, trying to earn a living in a world that offered few easy paths. Their world was one of stark contrasts. The green, ancient mountains held communities bound by blood and tradition, where folks lived by the seasons and the grace of God. But cutting through this old world were the black veins of the new one, the coal mines. Company towns sprung up overnight, filled with the soot of the tipple and the clang of steel on rock. Life was hard, pay was low, and the company store kept everyone in a state of perpetual debt. This friction between the old ways and the new money created a constant, simmering tension. The payroll wagon was a symbol of it all, a tempting prize moving through a land of desperate men. Standing watch over this fragile peace was Sheriff Banquo Fletcher. Before he became a legend, he was simply the law. He was a constant, predictable presence, as much a part of the landscape as the hawk circling the ridge. You'd see him at the general store, not saying much, but listening to everything. He knew whose cow had gone missing, whose son was running with the wrong crowd, and which feuds were simmering just below the surface. He was the community's anchor, a man who believed in a simple, unshakable truth. There was right and there was wrong, and it was his job to stand on that line. But Fletcher was more than just a badge. He was born of these hills, and he understood their silent language. He felt the weight of every family's troubles, every whispered fear. This connection to his people was his strength, but it was also a heavy burden. He saw the desperation the coal companies bred, and he knew it would eventually boil over into violence. He was one man holding back a flood, and he knew it. His quiet, solitary life was a reflection of the immense responsibility he carried on his shoulders alone. The world that was, before Silas Kane pulled the trigger, was one of fragile order. It was a community holding its breath, praying that the simmering tensions wouldn't erupt into open flame. Thomas Miller and David Eames were part of that order, men doing their duty. Sheriff Fletcher was its ultimate guardian, but their peaceful world had a shadow, a dark place where the law didn't reach and fear held sway. The murder of those two guards wasn't just a crime, it was a challenge. It was Silas Kane declaring that the old rules were dead and that even the mountains couldn't protect you anymore. The scene of the attack was on a lonely stretch of road winding through a deep cut in the mountain, a place where the sun struggled to reach the forest floor even at midday. The payroll wagon sat askew, one wheel splintered in a ditch. The two horses stood unnaturally still in their harnesses, their heads bowed, their coats trembling despite the cool air. A profound and terrible silence had fallen over the hollow, broken only by the drip of water from moss-covered rocks. The payroll box was gone, its hasp broken and discarded in the mud. The bodies of Miller and Eames lay where they fell, covered by canvas blankets that couldn't hide the dark stains seeping into the earth. When Sheriff Fletcher arrived, he didn't join the quiet, grim-faced huddle of men who had discovered the wagon. He moved away from them, his grey eyes scanning not the wagon, but the woods surrounding it. He walked the perimeter of the clearing in a slow, deliberate circle, his gaze fixed on the ground. He was reading the forest floor like a page in a book, taking in every bent twig, every disturbed patch of last year's leaves. He was a man searching for a story, and he knew these woods would tell him the truth if he just knew how to listen. The clues he found were chilling, not for what they revealed, but for what they didn't. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic footprints of men running for their lives. There was only one set of tracks leading from the tree line and one set leading back. They were from a single man, a heavy man, moving with a calm, unhurried gait. And then Fletcher found the most unnerving clue of all. On a flat, mossy rock about 20 yards from the wagon, he found two spent rifle cartridges. They weren't scattered where they would have been ejected from the chamber. They were placed neatly side by side, like a pair of cufflinks set out for church. This was what unsettled everyone more than the violence itself. This wasn't the work of a panicked thief. The careful placement of the shells was a message. It was a statement of absolute control, of a chilling lack of fear. It spoke of a killer who had watched his victims fall and then taken the time to gather his brass and leave a signature. The wilderness offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions. Who was this man? And what kind of cold-blooded pride did it take to commit murder and then pause to arrange the evidence like a trophy? The scene spoke not of chaos, but of a terrifying predatory calm. Before the dust had even settled on the lonely mountain road, a name was already being whispered from the company town to the deepest hollows. It was the name of a man with a grudge as raw and public as an open wound. Jedediah Schofield. Schofield was a miner, or at least he had been. He was a man known for a temper as hot as a forge and a pride as sharp and brittle as shale. and everyone in Blackwater County knew he hated Thomas Miller with a passion that burned cold. The bad blood had started 6 months earlier, deep in the belly of the earth. Schofield, a top man with the dynamite, had gotten into a bitter argument with another miner, an argument that turned into a brutal fistfight right there in the shaft. The shift foreman had been Thomas Miller. Following company rules, Miller reported the fight, and since Schofield had thrown the first punch, he was the one who was fired. He lost his job, his pay, and the small company house where his family lived. In a single day, he was cast out. To a man like Schofield, this was more than losing a job. It was a public shaming. He blamed Thomas Miller entirely, seeing him not as a man doing his duty, but as a traitor who had sided with the company against his own kind. In the weeks that followed, Schofield's bitterness festered. He was seen in the local saloons, his voice thick with moonshine and rage, vowing revenge. More than one person heard him swear that he would see Miller in his grave before he and his family starved. The whispers quickly turned into a roar of accusation. Jedediah Schofield owned a deer rifle, the same caliber as the shells Fletcher had found. He was a crack shot, known for his skill in the woods. Most damning of all, when the deputy went to the rundown shack Schofield's family had moved into, he was gone. His wife, her face pale with fear, claimed he'd gone hunting a few days back and hadn't returned, but the community saw it differently. To them, it was an open and shut case, a man with a clear motive, the right skills, and who had conveniently vanished at the exact time of the crime. Schofield had run, and in the mountains, only a guilty man runs. While the whole county had its eyes fixed on Jedediah Schofield, Sheriff Fletcher's gaze, grey and steady as a river stone, settled on someone else entirely. It was a person so close to the tragedy that no one thought to look at him. Caleb Thorne, the best friend of the young guard, David Eames. Caleb and David had been inseparable since they were boys, their bond forged in the creeks and woods of Blackwater County. They were two sides of the same coin, sharing every secret and every dream of a life beyond the coal dust. No one seemed more devastated by David's death than Caleb. No one, that is, except Sheriff Fletcher. He had seen grief in all its forms, and Caleb's felt wrong. It was too loud, too theatrical. At the funeral, Caleb wept with a noise that drowned out the quiet sorrow of the boy's own mother. But Fletcher, standing at the back of the cemetery, noted that for all the performance, the man's eyes were sharp and restless. He wasn't looking at the grave, he was watching the crowd. Fletcher knew that true grief turns a man inward, but Caleb Thorne was looking outward, like a man checking to see if his story was being believed. Beneath that mask of sorrow was a secret that was rotting Caleb from the inside out. He wasn't just a simple mine worker, he was a gambler who had fallen in deep with a dangerous crowd from the railroad camps. He owed a debt so large it was a death sentence, and the men he owed were not known for their patience. The company payroll wasn't just a target of opportunity for him, it was his only way out. His best friend, David Eames, hadn't just been a friend. He was Caleb's unwitting key to the prize, a source of information about the wagon's route and its schedule. The whispers started when Caleb was seen just days after the funeral, paying off a chunk of his debt at a saloon with crisp bills. When questioned, he claimed he'd won a lucky hand at cards. But the story felt thin, and his behavior, when re-examined, painted a darker picture. People now remembered Caleb asking David pointed questions about the guard rotation, questions that seemed innocent at the time, but now felt sinister. The idea was almost too ugly to consider, that the attack wasn't a random ambush, but a meticulously planned execution, and that David Eames might have been betrayed by the one person on earth he trusted completely. But there was a third shadow in these hills, one cast not by a single man, but by the towering black tipple of the mine itself. The Black Mountain Coal Company was more than an employer. It was a hungry, faceless power from the north, and its interests rarely aligned with the well-being of the men it paid in scrip. In the months leading up to the robbery, a new kind of man had been seen in the county. Men in dark suits and city hats, with faces as hard and emotionless as the company ledger books. They weren't miners or managers. They were troubleshooters, company enforcers, and their presence felt like the stillness before a storm. Their motive was impersonal, but immense. Whispers of unionizing had been snaking through the mine shafts, talk of better pay and safer conditions. To the company, the union wasn't a negotiation. It was a disease to be eradicated. A violent, unsolved payroll robbery was the perfect pretext. It would justify flooding the county with their own heavily armed guards, men who answered not to the law, but to the company. They could lock down the towns, root out the organizers, and break the spirit of the rebellion under the guise of protecting the people from a phantom killer. Miller and Eames, in this cold calculation, were simply the cost of doing business. The arrival of these city men had draped a blanket of unease over the community. They didn't speak to locals, they observed, their eyes taking measure of everything. They were seen mapping the roads, timing the payroll wagon's route, and holding quiet, tense meetings behind the locked door of the company office. Their presence was a silent, constant threat. It was a clear message from the powers up north that they were watching, and that they would not tolerate dissent. The mountain folk, who had dealt with their own problems for generations, now felt the chilling gaze of an outside world that saw their home as nothing more than a resource to be exploited and controlled. The crime itself bore the hallmarks of this cold, corporate ruthlessness. The clean, efficient nature of the ambush, the lack of any wasted motion, and especially the chilling signature of the carefully placed shell casings. It all felt less like the hot-blooded revenge of a fired miner and more like the work of a professional. It was a calculated act of terror designed to create chaos. Perhaps the stolen money was never the point. Perhaps the real prize was fear itself, a tool the company could wield to crush the growing defiance of the men who worked and died in its mines. With Jedediah Schofield named as the prime suspect, a posse of grim-faced men formed, fueled by righteous anger and cheap corn liquor. They were ready to deliver mountain justice with a rope. Sheriff Fletcher led them, but he moved with a different purpose. While the others saw a clear trail of vengeance, Fletcher saw a path that was too obvious, too neat. He wasn't hunting a man he hated, he was solving a puzzle. And he knew the first piece you find isn't always the one that fits. For 4 days, they beat the brush, scouring the unforgiving ridges and impenetrable rhododendron thickets that Schofield called home. The mountains, however, are experts at hiding men, and the trail was cold. It wasn't Fletcher who found him, but a young deputy who stumbled upon an old trapper's lean-to deep in a forgotten hollow. Inside, they found Jedediah Schofield, not defiant, but gaunt and shivering, his rifle unused beside him. He hadn't been running from the law, he had been hiding from it. He knew he was the first man they'd blame, and his terror was so genuine it was almost palpable. His alibi, when it came, was as solid and immovable as the mountain itself. He had been miles away from the ambush, helping the circuit preacher, old Reverend Eli, repair the roof on the remote Black Creek Chapel. He'd been there for a solid week, sleeping in the church and sharing the preacher's meager meals. The Reverend, a man whose word was considered scripture in those parts, confirmed it without a moment's hesitation. Jedediah Schofield was a man full of rage and bitterness, but he was no killer. The most promising lead had evaporated into thin mountain air. Attention then shifted to Caleb Thorne, but that trail was made of smoke and mirrors. There was no physical evidence, only the foul taste of suspicion. He had an answer for everything. The money? A lucky night playing cards with strangers at a railroad camp, men who were long gone. His odd questions to David. Just the normal curiosity of a friend. The community, unwilling to stomach the thought of such a venomous betrayal, chose to believe him. To accuse him without proof was to call one of their own a monster, a truth too ugly to face. The investigation had hit a wall of solid granite, leaving Sheriff Fletcher with nothing but a pair of spent shells and a county where the fear was beginning to grow teeth. With the official investigation stalled, a cold fog of silence settled over Blackwater County. The lively chatter at the general store died down whenever Sheriff Fletcher walked in. Doors that were once open were now latched, and eyes that met yours on the road would slide away, refusing to connect. It was as if the whole community had collectively agreed to forget the murders had ever happened. Neighbors who had once shared every piece of gossip now saw nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing. The truth, it seemed, was a dangerous secret to possess. This silence was woven from three distinct threads. The first was raw, simple fear. A killer was among them, a man who had shot down two people in cold blood and left a chilling signature of his arrogance. He was a ghost, a name without a face, and he could be anyone. To speak a word of what you might have seen, to even speculate out loud, was to risk drawing his attention. It was to risk waking up and finding your own grim message left on your doorstep. The wolf was still in the woods, and no one wanted to be the next sheep to stray from the flock. The second thread was a deep, abiding hatred for the Black Mountain Coal Company. To many of the mountain folk, the company was a far greater evil than any one killer. It was a faceless monster that stole their land, poisoned their streams, and worked their men to death for pennies. The stolen money belonged to the company, and the dead guards were on the company payroll. In their minds, helping Fletcher was helping the company. It was a choice between two evils, and many chose silence as a form of quiet rebellion against the power that oppressed them every single day. But the thickest, strongest thread was the mountain code itself, an unspoken omerta, as binding as any law on the books. You did not talk to the law about the affairs of your neighbors. You handled your own business, settled your own scores, and you never, ever turned on your own kind for an outsider. And to many, even Sheriff Fletcher, in his official capacity, was an outsider to family matters. This loyalty, this stubborn, ingrained belief in their own form of justice, formed a wall far higher and stronger than any prison. Fletcher found himself on the outside of his own community, a lawman trying to find a killer in a town that had gone deaf, dumb, and blind. 5 years turned to dust. The seasons in Blackwater County rolled on, covering the memory of the murders with layers of autumn leaves and winter snow. The case went cold, a ghost story whispered by old men, a permanent quiet failure that Sheriff Banquo Fletcher carried in the lines on his face. The two spent shells still sat on his desk in a small wooden box, a cold testament to a question he couldn't answer. The community's wall of silence had held, and the truth seemed lost to time. The clue that broke it all came not from a clever deduction or a piece of new evidence, but from the rambling memory of an old woman on the edge of the next world. Granny Elspeth lived in a one-room cabin perched like a hawk's nest on a ridge overlooking the very road where the ambush took place. Her mind, the folks in town said, was a tangled thicket of memories and mountain lore, and her words were often dismissed as the wind in the pines. Fletcher, however, made a point of checking on the old woman, bringing her salt and flour when the snows were deep. On one such visit, sitting by her hearth, he listened as she drifted through the past. She spoke of the hard winter of '08, of a blight that killed the chestnut trees, and then, without any change in her tone, she said something that made the air in the tiny cabin stand still. "Such a shame about that young Eames boy," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He was always so polite. I saw him walking up the road that very morning with his friend Caleb Thorne. They was laughing, heads together like they was sharing a secret. Not an hour later, I heard the guns. For Sheriff Fletcher, it was as if the last 5 years had collapsed into a single blinding instant. Caleb Thorne's alibi had been rock solid. He had been at the mine, working a full shift. Multiple men had sworn to it. But Granny Elspeth, whose cabin sat miles from the mine entrance, had seen him on the murder road with the victim just before he died. It wasn't a confession she offered, but a simple, unvarnished memory, one that nobody had ever thought to ask for. The old woman, dismissed by everyone, had been the only witness. In that moment, the entire case was reborn. Fletcher realized the horrifying truth. Caleb's alibi hadn't been solid. It had been constructed. He had paid or threatened his fellow miners to lie for him, a conspiracy of silence bought with stolen payroll money. The laughter Granny Elspeth heard hadn't been the sound of friendship. It had been the sound of betrayal. The case wasn't just cold. It had been buried alive. And Sheriff Fletcher had just been handed the shovel. A 5-year-old lie is a brittle thing. With Granny Elspeth's testimony in his pocket, Sheriff Fletcher moved with the cold patience of a winter freeze. He didn't go for Caleb Thorne. Not yet. He went for the men who had built the walls of his alibi. He found them one by one, in the mines, in their homes, at the saloon. He didn't threaten or shout. He simply sat with them, his grey eyes unblinking, and told them what the old woman on the ridge had seen. He spoke of perjury, of being an accessory to murder, and then he would fall silent, letting the weight of what they had done crush them. The first miner held out for an hour, the second for 10 minutes. The third broke before Fletcher even finished his sentence. The confrontation, when it came, was on the porch of the small, respectable house Caleb Thorne had bought with his blood money. He had grown soft in 5 years, the desperate gambler replaced by a man who believed his own lies. He greeted the sheriff with a confident smile, but it faltered and died when he saw the look on Fletcher's face. The lawman wasn't there for a social call. "I spoke with Granny Elspeth," Fletcher began, his voice flat. "She remembers seeing you that morning, Caleb, on the road with David, just before the shots." Caleb scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "An old woman's fancies. I was at the mine. Ask anyone." And that was the moment Fletcher sprung the trap. "I did," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I asked Tom Jenkins, and I asked Sam Carter." Their memories seemed to have gotten a lot clearer in the last 24 hours. The color drained from Caleb's face. The mask of the respected citizen shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered animal beneath. Fletcher took a step closer, his shadow falling over the other man. "But here's the thing that's been bothering me, Caleb. The tracks at the scene, they were from a big man, a heavy man, and those shells placed so neat. That wasn't your style. You're a coward. You always were. You didn't have the nerve to pull the trigger." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and cold. "You just led your best friend into the woods to be slaughtered like a hog. You gave the route, the time, everything. And you did it for a man in a city suit, a company man, the one who came down to break the union talk, a big man named Corbin." Fletcher's voice was relentless, each word a hammer blow breaking down the last of Caleb's defenses. "He pulled the trigger, and you collected your 30 pieces of silver. It was all there, the whole sickening truth. It wasn't a crime of passion or a simple robbery born of desperation. It was a cold-blooded business deal. The Black Mountain Coal Company needed an excuse to crush its workers, and Caleb Thorne, drowning in debt, was their willing instrument. He sold out his friend, his community, and his own soul. Caleb didn't confess with words. He simply collapsed, folding in on himself on the porch steps, a hollowed-out man whose guilt was now as plain to see as the mountains against the sky. The ghost finally had a face, and it was the face of a friend. Let us now step back into the shadows of that terrible morning. This is not a story from a court record, but a reconstruction pieced together from a confession, a dying woman's memory, and the cold logic of the crime scene itself. This is how it must have been. The morning air was cool and heavy, with the damp smell of moss and wet earth. David Eames walked up the road with a lightness in his step, laughing at a joke told by the man he trusted most in the world, Caleb Thorne. He was young, and his mind was on his future, not on the deep shadows pooling between the ancient trees. From those shadows, a shape detached itself. A big man in a city coat, his face impassive. This was Corbin, the company enforcer. There was no warning, no shouted demand. David likely didn't even have time to register the man as a threat before the hollow was shattered by a single flat crack that was not thunder. It was a sound that slapped the air and sent the birds scattering from the trees in a frantic, silent explosion. It was not a fight. It was an execution. For David, there would have been a moment of searing confusion, a feeling of the world tilting on its axis, and perhaps, in his last second of sight, he would have seen his best friend's face contorted, not with surprise, but with a terrible, knowing guilt. Thomas Miller, a man who had survived 30 years of rockfalls and dynamite blasts, was a professional. His hand would have instinctively dropped to the pistol on his hip. But he was not a gunfighter, and he was facing a different kind of danger than the mountain had ever offered. A second crack echoed the first, a brutal full stop to the sentence that had just begun. The reins slipped from his calloused hands, and his 50 years of hard-earned life spilled out onto the dirt road he had traveled 1,000 times. The aftermath was a scene of chilling, methodical precision. The big man, Corbin, moved with an unhurried grace. He walked to the mossy rock and deliberately placed the two spent shells side by side, a gesture of pure, contemptuous power. It was his signature on a piece of human wreckage. The sharp tang of gunpowder hung in the air, a profane incense in the cathedral of the woods. Then, from deep in the rhododendron, came a different sound, a wretched, heaving gasp. It was the sound of Caleb Thorne, the Judas, being sick in the bushes, his body finally rebelling against the monstrous thing his greed had unleashed. When they were done, the payroll box was opened, and the money exchanged hands. One man walked away with a clean kill and a broken union. The other stumbled away with a lifetime of guilt and blood on his hands that no amount of money could ever wash clean. After the sound of their departure faded, the woods fell silent again. But it was a new kind of silence. It was heavier, broken, and for a long, long time, the birds did not return to their song. The Blackwater County Courthouse had never seen a trial like it. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of the entire community, a sea of grim, weathered faces. It was a pressure cooker of old grief and new anger. At the defendant's table sat two men who were worlds apart. Caleb Thorne was a ghost, a hollowed-out man who stared at the floorboards as if they held the secrets to his damnation. Beside him, cool and impassive, sat Corbin, the company man. Flanked by lawyers from the city with slicked-back hair and alligator-skin briefcases, he looked not like a man on trial for his life, but like a landowner inspecting a property he was about to foreclose on. The trial became a battle not over facts, but over which world held more truth. The county prosecutor presented a simple, brutal story of betrayal, backed by the tearful, coerced confessions of the miners who had lied for Caleb. He put Granny Elspeth on the stand, her voice frail, but her memory clear as a mountain spring. But Corbin's lawyers were masterful. They painted a picture of a backwards, ignorant community engaged in a conspiracy against the company that fed them. They portrayed Granny Elspeth as a senile old woman, the miners as liars trying to save their own skins, and Caleb Thorne as a desperate man who would say anything to lessen his own sentence. For Caleb Thorne, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. His confession and the testimony of the men he'd paid off sealed his fate. The jury, made up of men he had known his whole life, looked at him not with hatred, but with a profound and weary contempt. They found him guilty of being an accessory to murder in less than an hour. The judge, his voice like cracking stone, sentenced him to life at hard labor in the state penitentiary. Caleb didn't even flinch. He was led away in chains, a man who had already started serving his sentence 5 years earlier in a prison of his own making. But for Corbin, the wheels of justice turned differently. They were greased with company money. His lawyers produced train tickets, hotel registries, and sworn affidavits from businessmen in Knoxville, all placing him 100 miles away on the day of the murders. It was a perfect, ironclad alibi, constructed with the same cold precision as the crime itself. Faced with the contradictory testimony of mountain folk on one side and documented, official-looking proof on the other, the jury was paralyzed by doubt. The word of a dozen miners could not outweigh a single stamped piece of paper from the city. After 2 days of deliberation, they delivered their verdict. For the murder of Thomas Miller and David Eames, the jury found the defendant, Mr. Corbin, not guilty. A wave of stunned silence washed over the courtroom, followed by a low, collective growl of disbelief. Corbin showed no emotion. He simply adjusted his tie, shook his lawyer's hands, and walked out of the courthouse a free man, leaving the people of Blackwater County choking on a brand of justice that felt more like poison. The law had punished the traitor, but the man who pulled the trigger had vanished back into the world of money and power from which he came, as untouchable as a shadow. For the families of Thomas Miller and David Eames, the verdicts brought no peace, only a quiet, permanent ache. The community wrapped its arms around them, but their losses carved out a silence that could never be filled. David's sweetheart, a girl whose future had been so bright, never married. She grew into a quiet, sad-eyed woman who always wore a locket with his picture, her life a long, slow testament to a promise that was broken by a bullet. The Millers, once a boisterous and central family in the county, drew into themselves, their grief a constant, unspoken presence at their dinner table. They had received the law's answer, but it did nothing to quiet the echoes of the guns. Jedediah Schofield, the man who had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, was legally a free man, but his reputation never fully recovered. In the hollers, where memories are long and suspicion is a survival instinct, the stain of the accusation lingered. He was no longer the hot-tempered miner. He was the man they almost hung for the payroll. The whispers followed him, poisoning his relationships and curdling his already bitter spirit. He became a solitary man, his anger at the world turning inward, leaving him isolated by a crime he did not commit. He was a second kind of victim, his life forever altered by the lie that had almost cost him everything. Caleb Thorne's fate was a slow erasure. He was sent to the state prison, a brutal place of rock quarries and sun-baked fields from which few men returned whole. His name in Blackwater County became a curse, a cautionary tale told to children about the evils of greed and betrayal. His family, unable to bear the shame, sold their small plot of land and moved away in the dead of night, their name vanishing from the county records as if they had never existed. Caleb Thorne simply ceased to be a person, becoming a number in a ledger, a ghost haunting the prison walls until he was forgotten by all but one man. And Corbin? He vanished like a wisp of smoke. The Black Mountain Coal Company, its union problem now brutally solved, transferred him out of the state. He left no records, no forwarding address, no trace. He was a phantom, an instrument of corporate will who had done his job and been recalled. For the people of Blackwater County, his acquittal was a bitter lesson in the nature of power. It proved what they had always suspected, that there were two kinds of law in the world. There was their law, the law of the mountains, and there was the company's law, the law of money, which could make a murderer disappear in broad daylight. This case changed Banquo Fletcher. The sight of Corbin walking free carved something deep into his soul. It taught him that the courthouse could deliver a verdict, but not always justice. He grew quieter, more solitary, his methods more relentless. He had seen the law fail, and in that failure he seemed to find a harder resolve. He would deliver his man to the courthouse if he could, but he would deliver justice no matter what. The memory of Corbin's smug, emotionless face would fuel his hunt for every outlaw that followed, a cold fire that would one day lead him to the mouth of the black hole in pursuit of a different killer and a different, darker kind of judgment. If you travel the back roads of Blackwater County today, you can still find the scars left by this story. The old company road is paved now, but the deep cut where the ambush happened remains, a place where the shadows lie a little thicker and the air feels a little colder. In the town square, the old courthouse still stands, its brick facade a silent witness to the flawed justice it once dispensed. But the most tangible remnants lie in the church graveyard, on a hill overlooking the valley. There you will find two simple, weathered stones side by side. One for Thomas Miller, a husband and father. The other for David Eames, a son and brother. Their names, carved in stone, are a permanent record of a debt that was never fully paid. Down by the river, the Black Mountain Coal Company tipple is a skeleton of rust and rot, slowly being devoured by kudzu and time. It stands as a monument not to industry, but to a forgotten era of exploitation and greed. The company is long gone, its name just a whisper on the wind, but the distrust it sowed took deep root in that mountain soil. For generations after, the arrival of any man in a suit from the city was met with a wall of silent, watchful suspicion. The story of Corbin became a cautionary tale, a lesson taught to children about the kind of evil that money can buy and the law cannot touch. The tragedy of the payroll murders lives on, not in history books, but in the way a story survives in the mountains, through folklore. Old folks still tell it, sometimes as a ghost story, sometimes as a lesson in betrayal. They say that if you listen closely on a still night, you can still hear the echo of those two gunshots rolling through the hollow. And for a while, there was even a song, a mournful ballad passed around the campfires and front porches called Caleb's Coin, a tune that spoke of the terrible price of 30 pieces of silver earned in a friend's blood. This is how a crime becomes a part of the landscape. It's more than just a memory. It becomes a piece of the county's identity, a part of its DNA. The story of what happened on that lonely road reinforced the mountain code, hardening it. It taught the people that the law of outsiders was fickle, and that their own silence, while sometimes a shield for the guilty, was their only true protection. While the world outside might forget, the Appalachian Mountains themselves hold these memories, etched into the landscape and the hearts of its people. At the beginning of our story, we asked a simple question. Who was responsible for the deaths of Thomas Miller and David Eames? The answer, we found, was never simple at all. The law points to one man, Caleb Thorne, a traitor who paid for his sin with the rest of his life. And in the cold, hard print of a law book, that is where the story ends. But we know better. We know that justice in these hills is rarely so neat. The man who pulled the trigger walked free, his guilt washed clean by money and a well-told lie, leaving behind a wound in the heart of the county that never truly healed. This story, then, is not just about a crime. It is about the brutal collision of two worlds, the old world of mountain honor and the new world of corporate greed that saw men not as souls, but as numbers on a ledger. It's a lesson in how a community's silence can hide a monster, but also how the quietest voice, that of a forgotten old woman, can be the one that finally speaks the truth. For Sheriff Banquo Fletcher, it was a crucible. It burned away any naive faith he had in a system and forged in him an unshakable belief in a higher, harder law, the mountain's law, where a man's guilt is not decided by a jury, but by the weight of his own sins. The court records in the state capitol will tell you that this case is closed. But here, in the deep hollows where the truth still whispers on the wind, the story is very much alive. It serves as a stark reminder that while the law may have its verdict, the mountains have their memory. And that memory is long, and it is unforgiving. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story, or at least as much of it as the mountains are willing to give up. The newspapers called it the Fraterville mine disaster. A tragic number etched in history. 216 men and boys gone in an instant. But numbers are cold, and they can't tell you the real story. They can't describe what it's like to sit in absolute darkness, hundreds of feet underground, listening to the air run out as you write a final letter to your wife. They can't make you feel the horror of a father holding his dying son on his lap. They say it was an accident. But the true story of Fraterville isn't about the explosion that shook the earth. It's about what happened after, in the suffocating silence. Today, we're not just telling a story. We're going to listen to the voices of the dead, reading the last words they scratched onto paper from inside their own tomb. Imagine Fratterville, Tennessee, on the morning of May 19th, 1902. It wasn't a town so much as a collection of wooden houses clinging to the hillsides, all painted the same color by the company, all breathing the same coal-tinged air. Life here was simple and hard, governed by the rising of the sun and the shriek of the mine whistle. The mountains of Coal Creek weren't just a backdrop. They were the provider and the master, giving families their daily bread from the dark seams of coal hidden in their belly. In these small homes, a familiar ritual played out before dawn. Wives rose in the dim light to stoke the fire and cook breakfast, the smell of biscuits and coffee mingling with the ever-present scent of coal dust. Men pulled on their stiff work clothes, their faces already smudged with the shadow of their trade. These were the moments that made up a life. A quick kiss goodbye at the door, a hand ruffling a child's hair, a promise to be home for supper. For the men of Fratterville, descending into the earth was as natural as breathing. Among them was Jacob Vowell, a 47-year-old man with the steady hands and quiet dignity of a veteran miner. He was a family man, respected in the community. Walking beside him was his 14-year-old son, Elbert. In those days, boys became men in the darkness of the mines, learning the dangerous trade from their fathers. For Elbert, working alongside his dad wasn't just a job. It was a rite of passage, a step into the world of men. They were part of a brotherhood of 216 souls that morning. Husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons, some boys no older than Elbert. They walked together toward the gaping mouth of the mine, their lunch pails clanking, their carbide lamps not yet lit. The air was cool, the sky was beginning to lighten, and the world above ground was waking up to a beautiful spring day. There was no sense of doom, no premonition of what was to come. It was just another Monday. They stepped onto the man trip, the string of open cars that would carry them down the sloping shaft into the heart of the mountain. The journey into the darkness was a daily routine, the familiar rumble of the wheels a mundane soundtrack to their lives. They joked and talked, their voices echoing briefly before being swallowed by the immense, earthy silence of the deep. But the mountain they trusted was holding a secret. Deep within the labyrinthine tunnels, a pocket of methane gas, odorless and invisible, was seeping from the coal seam. It was a time bomb, silently counting down. Every foot the men traveled deeper into the earth brought them closer to the moment when their ordinary world would be torn apart by a roar from hell itself. Deep inside the earth, the men worked in the flickering glow of their carbide lamps. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and coal. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of shovels against rock and the metallic ring of pickaxes striking the black seam. And then, in one of the far-flung tunnels, it happened. A miner's open flame, the very tool that let him see in the dark, touched a pocket of invisible methane gas. In that single fatal instant, the air itself caught fire. The explosion wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force, a giant fist that punched through the mine's narrow arteries. It ignited the fine, suspended coal dust, creating a secondary, even more powerful blast that ripped through the tunnels at the speed of sound. A wave of fire and pressure shot outwards, snuffing out lamps and lives without distinction. For the men caught in its path, there was no time to scream. The world simply ceased to exist. On the surface, at 7:20 in the morning, the ground trembled as if a beast had woken from a long slumber. A deep, guttural roar erupted from the mouth of the mine, a sound that rattled windows and shook the very souls of the people in Fratterville. It was followed by a geyser of black smoke, splintered timbers, and mangled machinery that shot hundreds of feet into the sky. The mine, The town's source of life was now breathing fire and death. Within moments, the routine of the morning was shattered by screams. Wives and children, their faces masks of terror, ran toward the mine entrance. But what they found was a vision from hell. The wooden structures of the tipple were engulfed in flames, and a thick, choking smoke billowed from the shaft, blocking any hope of entry. The force of the blast had not only sealed the entrance, it had destroyed the mine's massive ventilation fan. The lungs of the mountain had been ripped out. Deep inside, in the furthest reaches of the mine where the blast hadn't reached, a few dozen men were thrown to the ground. Their lamps were extinguished, plunging them into a darkness more profound than any they had ever known. The air thrummed, and then an unearthly silence fell. They were alive, but they were cut off. The air they were breathing was now a finite resource, a dwindling supply in a sealed stone coffin. The clock on their survival had begun to tick. In the absolute blackness, the survivors gathered. The thunder of the explosion had faded, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. The air, once merely damp and earthy, now carried a new taste, sharp and metallic. It was the taste of afterdamp, the poisonous cocktail of gases left behind by the blast. They knew what it meant. There would be no rescue. Death wasn't coming for them with fire and fury. It was seeping toward them, silent and invisible. In this moment, faced with the end, Jacob Vowell became their anchor. He didn't preach hope where there was none. Instead, he offered them a final defiant purpose. He told any man with a pencil and a scrap of paper to write. Write to their wives, their children, their mothers. Write the words they would never get to say. In the suffocating darkness of their tomb, these men, whose hands were calloused from swinging a pickaxe, began the delicate work of writing their last goodbyes. Imagine the scene. A handful of dying carbide lamps cast a ghostly flickering glow, creating dancing shadows on the coal-black walls. The only sounds were the ragged coughing of men fighting for each breath and the soft, steady scratch of pencil lead on paper. Men leaned against the cold rock, trying to steady their hands, pouring a lifetime of love onto a few precious inches of paper. They weren't writing about death. They were writing about life, about the families waiting for them under a sun they would never see again. Jacob Vowell wrote to his Sarah, his words a simple, heartbreaking testament. Tell my little boys to be good boys and to trust in the Lord. He was a father to the very end. Beside him, his 14-year-old son Elbert, his strength failing, lay his head in his father's lap. In the dimming light, Jacob watched his son's breathing grow shallow, watched him drift into a sleep from which he would not wake. Then, with a hand that must have trembled, Jacob Vowell made one last entry in the margins of his letter. He didn't describe the horror. He wrote a sentence of pure, devastating fact. My boy Elbert has gone to sleep. He has been dead for a few minutes. It was a final act of a father recording his son's peaceful passage, a final whisper of love in a world that had turned to black. One by one, the lamps sputtered and died, plunging the chamber into a darkness that was total. The scratching of pencils ceased. The ragged breaths grew fainter, until at last there was only silence. On the bodies of the dead, pocket watches continued to tick for a few minutes more before they, too, stopped, their hands frozen on the final moment when the last bit of life-giving air was gone from the room. For 3 long days, Fraterville held its breath. The fire at the mine entrance was eventually smothered, but the mountain remained a sealed tomb. On the surface, a grim vigil of hope against reason took hold. Wives and mothers stood in small, silent groups, their eyes fixed on the smoking hole in the ground that had swallowed their world. The company brought in experts and rescue teams, made up of miners from neighboring towns, worked tirelessly, risking their own lives with every step they took into the poisoned darkness. The air inside was a killer, silent and patient. Rescuers had to work in short, desperate bursts, clearing rubble and shoring up collapsed tunnels, all while battling the suffocating afterdamp. With each foot they gained, the hope of finding anyone alive dwindled, replaced by the grim determination to at least bring the men home for a proper burial. They found the first bodies near the entrance, victims of the blast's initial violent fury. But the deeper they went, the more the destruction gave way to an eerie, undisturbed silence. Finally, they reached the crude barricade of rock and clothing. They knew men were behind it. Carefully, they dismantled the wall, stone by stone. The first beam of a rescuer's lamp cut through the darkness and fell upon a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 26 men were lying on the ground. There was no sign of a struggle, no panic. They looked as if they had simply laid down to rest, many with their arms around each other in a final brotherly embrace. And then they saw the letters, tucked into pockets, clutched in hands, or placed carefully on their chests, were the final messages from the dark. As the bodies were solemnly carried out into the daylight, the news of the letters spread through the grieving crowd like a whisper. This tragedy now had a voice. These were not just numbers in a death toll. They were husbands and fathers who had spent their final moments thinking only of love. Fratterville had become a town of widows and orphans overnight. They say there weren't enough coffins in the county, and they had to be shipped in by the trainload, a final, heartbreaking measure of the town's immeasurable loss. There was no villain in a black hat to put on trial. There was only a company, a mountain, and 216 fresh graves. But the law demanded an answer, so a coroner's inquest was convened. It wasn't a grand trial in a stone courthouse. It was a proceeding held in the shadow of the disaster, a formal attempt to write the final chapter in the official record. For the widows of Fratterville, it was a desperate, flickering hope for accountability. For the Coal Creek Coal Company, it was a matter of containing the damage. Company officials and their lawyers spoke in measured tones. They offered condolences and expressed deep regret. They spoke of the inherent dangers of mining, of the unpredictable nature of the earth. The explosion, they argued, was a tragic accident, an act of God that no one could have foreseen or prevented. They presented charts and testimony from their own experts, painting a picture of a well-run operation that had simply fallen victim to a terrible misfortune. Against this polished defense, who was there to speak for the dead? The miners' letters were their final testimony, but they were testaments of love, not of legal negligence. The living miners in the community, the ones who would need a job when the grief subsided, knew better than to speak out against the only employer in town. To accuse the company was to risk your own family's survival. So they stayed silent, their anger and their knowledge of the mine's gassy reputation a heavy, unspoken secret in the room. The verdict, when it came, was as cold and hard as a seam of coal. The coroner's jury concluded that the miners had died from an explosion of methane gas and coal dust ignited by an open flame. But crucially, they assigned no legal blame. No charges were filed. The company was officially cleared of any criminal negligence. They offered recommendations for the future, the use of safer lamps, better ventilation, but these were suggestions, not punishments. Was this justice? The law of men, the formal system of courts and inquests, had spoken. It had rendered its verdict in clean, legal terms. The company was not a murderer, but a victim of circumstance. But for the people of Fratterville, for the women who now had to raise their children alone, the verdict was just another form of violence. It was a confirmation that the lives of their husbands and sons were worth less than the cost of implementing stricter safety measures. The company walked away free, ready to rebuild and reopen the mine. The town, however, was handed a life sentence of loss and unanswered questions. The inquest provided an official cause of death, but it offered no comfort and no justice. It was a quiet, brutal lesson in the way the world worked in 1902. The law protected property and profit, while the mountains kept the men. The town of Fraterville never recovered. It couldn't. How does a town built around 216 men continue to exist when they are all gone? It became a town of shadows, a community of widows and orphans, where the sound of the mine whistle was replaced by a profound and lasting silence. In time, families moved away, houses fell into disrepair, and Fraterville, the bustling coal town, slowly faded from the map, becoming little more than a name in a history book. But the story didn't vanish completely. It's carved in stone. If you know where to look, you can still find the Leech Cemetery. There, in a large grassy circle, lie the graves of many of the miners. It's known as the Fraterville Miners' Circle, a silent, circular monument to a shared fate. Walking among the headstones is a chilling experience. Name after name, all followed by the same date of death, May 19th, 1902. It's a physical ledger of the price paid for coal. And yet, the most powerful trace of that day isn't made of stone. It's made of paper and pencil lead. The letters, Jacob Vowell's final words to his Sarah, Eugene Daniels's prayer for his children, they survived. They were carefully passed down, preserved in archives and museums, their faded script a direct line to the heart of the tragedy. They are not just historical artifacts, they are sacred relics. When you read them, you are no longer a spectator to history. You are in that darkness with them, listening to the very last words of men who knew they were about to die. The mine itself is long gone, its entrance sealed over, reclaimed by the patient green of the mountains. Most people who drive those Tennessee roads today have no idea they're passing a place where an American tragedy unfolded. But the mountains remember. They hold the silence of that sealed-off tunnel, the weight of the grief that soaked into this soil. They remember the roar, the smoke, and the long, agonizing wait that followed. And they hold the echoes of the last words scratched out in the dark, a story of love that proved stronger than the stone that entombed it. So we return to the question we started with. What really happened in the Fraterville mine? An explosion killed 216 men. That is the fact. But it is not the truth. The truth is that in the final suffocating moments of their lives, a handful of ordinary men faced the end not with rage or panic, but with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity. They chose to spend their last ounce of life and breath not on themselves, but on sending one last message of love out of the darkness. The Fraterville disaster is a story of industrial negligence, a brutal lesson paid for in blood that would slowly, painfully lead to safer mines for future generations. But its truest legacy is not found in safety regulations. It's a lesson in what matters at the very end of everything. It teaches us that the human spirit, when stripped of all else, will reach for connection, for family, for love. In the blackest pit, these men found a light inside themselves and sent it outward. Their bodies were buried in the Tennessee earth over a century ago, their town swallowed by time. But their final words, scratched onto scraps of paper, have traveled through the years to find us. The mountain took their lives, but it could not silence their love. It couldn't bury their story.